Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Souvenirs. The story goes that there was once a blacksmith out west named Elias Crane, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who never raised his voice but spoke through the rhythm of his hammer. He lived on the edge of a dying town where the prairie met the desert, a place fed dust that in your lungs faster than hope air did. Elias wasn't known for words, but for work, the kind that left blisters, burns, and blessings in equal measure. Folks said he could forge anything: horseshoes that never bent, hinges that never squeaked, and plows that cut through stone like butter. But what set him apart wasn't his skill, it was his patience. He didn't rush heat, didn't strike before the metal was ready, and about power he used to mutter, sweat pouring off his brow, yet about timing. When the railroads came, the town filled with noise miners, traders, speculators, all dreaming of fast fortunes. They'd stop by Elias' forge for repairs or for luck, tossing him coins without looking him in the eye. He'd nod, take their money, and return to the rhythm of his hammer, but deep down, he watched. Feel the calm wash over you as visions of financial freedom and abundance take shape in your mind. This is your time to relax, breathe, and let the stories of triumph guide you toward your dreams. Rest now. The reason he cultivates burned faster than fire, and he learned how easily wealth could melt under pressure. He'd once dreamed of riches himself. When he was younger, he'd saved every penny, bought, mined, even planned to build a foundry. But a flood took it, house, tools, and the woman he loved. That was when Elias stopped chasing dreams of gold and started listening to the anvil instead. He said every ring of that hammer told him something about life, about patience, loss, and the strange art of shaping chaos into something useful. Then came Malcolm Reeves, a banker from the city, riding into town in a polished carriage and a suit too clean for dust. He'd heard about Elias, the prairie smith who never missed a strike. Reeves had offered him a proposition. Mr. Crane Reeves said, "I represent investors who could turn this forge into empire. Mass production, industrial scaling. You name your price." Elias looked up from the glowing iron, eyes go where the ash around him ain't for sale. Reeves laughed. "Everything for sale. You're sitting on opportunity, man. You could be rich beyond measure." Elias struck the iron once more, the sound ringing pure and final. "Rich beyond measure," he said. "That's the trick right there. I reckon if you can measure it, it ain't real wealth." Reeves left, red-faced and muttering about fools and wasted change. But that night, Elias sat by the dying forge fire, thinking. Maybe he was getting old. Maybe patience was just another word for fear. The town was shrinking. The trains didn't stop paid often. Maybe he'd been wrong to turn the banker away. He stared at the Evil, his old friend, scarred and shining in the moonlight. "What do you think?" he asked it. "One last strike or let it rest?" The wind answered, whistling through the cracks in the forge, sounding almost like laughter. The next morning, Elias set to work, not for the banker, not for money, but for meaning. He melted down every scrap of metal he had, horseshoes, nails, hinges, chains. For 3 days, he forged something new, something different. When he was done, it wasn't a tool or a weapon. It was a sculptured gleaming anvil made of silver and steel, polished till it shone, its sunlight trapped in metal. He placed it on a wooden stand in front of his shop and carved one word beneath it: bout. Folks laughed at first, said he'd lost his mind, said no one would buy a hunk of silver just sitting there gathering dust. But travelers started coming, courage types, poets, prospected, and preachers. They'd stare at that anvil for a while, touch it, and walk away quieter than they came. Soon, the silver anvil became something more than a curiosity. It became a lesson. Merchants left coins beside it, offerings. Lovers swore vows near it. Wanderers carved names into the wood, and slowly stories spread. They said the anvil didn't grant wishes. It reminded people of what mattered, the weight of work, the worth of patience, the music of small efforts done well. Elias never took credit. He just kept his forge lit, lending tools and hearts in equal measure. He didn't charge extra, didn't advertise, but his name began to travel farther than Reeves' empire e'er did. Years later, when Elias passed, the townsfolk gathered at his forge. No preacher, no sermon, just silence broken by the et of a hammer striking metal one last time, someone paying tribute. When they looked inside, they found the silver anvil still gleaming, untouched by rust or age. And on the wall behind it, carved deep into the wood, were Elias' final words. You can't forge gold from greed. You can only temper your soul with patience. The banker Reeves eventually went bankrupt, his empire eaten by faster men with sharper suits. He returned to that same town, older, broke, hollow-eyed. When he saw the silver anvil, he knelt beside it and wept, not for the money lost, but for the time he'd never slowed down enough to live. And the wind that night carried a sound on metal singing as if somewhere Elias Crane was still hammering, still reminding the world that real wealth don't glitter, it endures. The years rolled like wagon wheels over the plains, leaving deep ruts of memory where once there'd been only wind. The town that had nearly died when Elias Crane was alive began to stir again, slow and sure, like an ember catching wind after a long, cold night. They called it Crane Crossing, now small, quiet, honest. Folks didn't come for gold or oil or spectacle. They came for something rarer piece that couldn't be bought. The silver anvil still sat out front of the old forge, gleaming even when storms passed through. No one polished it. No one dared. The rain seemed to do it on its own, washing away dust like it was guarding the last breath of the man who made it. Children would press their hands against it, asking their ma if it was magic. The mothers just smiled and said, "Magic, just patience wearing a work shirt, darling." In time, the forge became a kind of chapel, not for praying, but for remembering. Ranchers brought their broken plow blades, old travelers brought keepsakes to mend, and every so on someone would sit by the anvil and talk to it like it could listen. Truth was, it did. Not in words, but in stillness. Then one autumn evening, long after the sun had dipped low and the prairie was painted in fire and shadow, a stranger came riding into town. His name was Wyatt Shore. Wasn't a drifter in the usual sense, didn't look lost, just searching, wore a city man jacket, but carried himself like someone who'd forgotten how to rest. His horse was lean, his eyes leaner. He tied up by the forge, slid off the saddle, and stared at that anvil for a long time without speaking. The townsfolk were used to silence, so no one bothered him. He stood there till the stars came out, then finally asked in a low, tired voice, That the one they talk about?" Old Maggie, Elias' niece, now keeper of the forge, looked on from sweeping. "That the one? Ain't much to look at, I reckon, unless you know what you're seeing." Wyatt nodded slow. "I've seen too much and not enough. Heard about it away from the city. Folks say people find clarity here." Maggie leaned on her broom. Clarity, a fancy word for what the heart already knows and the head keeps arguing with. He chuckled, a sound dry the air, then maybe I came to the right place. He pulled a small sachet from his coat, set it down beside the anvil, and opened it. "Undone love that weather. It is good. The good one to talk about it. Old Maggie, Elias' niece, now the keeper of the forge, looked on from sweeping. That the one? Ain't much to look at, I reckon, unless you know what you're seeing." Wyatt nodded slow. "I've seen too much and not enough. Heard about it away from the city. Folks say people find clarity here." Maggie leaned on her broom. Clarity, a fancy word for what the heart already knows and the head keeps arguing with. He chuckled, the sound dry the air, then maybe I came to the right place. He pulled a small sachet from his coat, set it down beside the anvil, and opened it. Inside was a silver pocket watch, fine work, but cracked through the glass. "It was my father," he said. "He built a business from nothing, a trade company that sold everything from horseshoes to hope. Worked himself half to death and expected me to do the same. I followed him, made the company bigger, faster, louder. But now he looked up, eyes distant. Now I don't sleep much, don't eat much, don't feel much. All that left of him is this damn watch, and a company running itself like a fire that forgot what it was burning for." He turned the watch in his hand, thumb brushing the crack. "You think your uncle really believed in this thing? That patience was worth more than gold?" Maggie smiled faintly. "He didn't believe it, son. He proved it. Every swing of that hammer, every scar on his hands was a verse in that sermon." Wyatt stared at the anvil. Its surface shimmering under starlight. "Funny thing," he said softly. "I ran to solve it in my pocket. Fine work, but cracked through the glass was my father," he said. "He built a business from nothing, a trade company that sold everything from horseshoes to hope. Worked himself half to death and expected me to do the same. I followed him, made the company bigger, faster, louder. But now," he looked up, eyes distant. "Now I don't sleep much, don't eat much, don't feel much. All that left of him is this damn watch, and a company running itself like a fire that forgot what it was burning for." He turned the watch in his hand, thumb brushing the crack. You think your uncle really believed in this thing? That patience was worth more than gold? Maggie smiled faintly. He didn't believe it, son. He proved it. Every swing of that hammer, every scar on his hands was a verse in that sermon. Wyatt stared at the anvil, its surface shimmering under starlight. Funny thing, he said softly. I've spent my whole life making noise, meetings, markets, money, and now I come all this way just to listen to silence. That how you know you're close, Maggie said. Knelt down, set the pocket watch gently atop the anvil. If there's still something left of the man who made this, may he can tell thee how to fix something that ain't broke, but don't work anymore. The air went still. Even the crickets seemed to pause. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a low, patient growl that echoed through the valley. And then, faint but real, came the sound of metal singing, not loud, not clear, just a soft, resonant hum, like heat rising from old steel. The anvil shimmered faintly, light bending in ways no lantern could explain. Wyatt blinked. You hear that? Maggie nodded slow. And the first time. Happened when someone brings truth instead of treasure. He smiled for the first time that night, the kind of smile that cost something. Yes, it took losing effort to find something worth hearing. He stood, hat in hand, and looked at the forge. Mind if I stay a while? Maybe try my hand at mending? Maggie grinned. Every soul welcome made, long and you're ready to swing honest. For the next few months, Wyatt stayed, learned to strike iron, to wait for the right glow before hitting. Learned how silence ain't emptiness, it potential. He mended tools, shoes, hinges, and hearts that folks thought were too far gone. And one evening, when he was working alone, he felt something stir deep in his chest, a rhythm old and familiar. He set down the hammer, opened the pocket watch, and smiled. It was ticking. No new parts, no repair, just time, patient and forgiving, finding its way back. He never did leave Crane Crossing after that. Said the city didn't need him anymore, but the forge did. When he passed on years later, the townsfolk buried him beside the anvil, his watch still ticking in the soil. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the stars were low, you could hear two hammers ringing in rhythm, one made of steel, the other made of memory. As time wore on, the forge at Crane Crossing became less a place of fire and more a place of memory. The air smelled not just of iron and ash, but of stories once whispered between the wind and the old walls that had seen generations come and go. Folks said every hammer that struck in that forge carried the weight of the men who'd come before. Elias Crane, Wyatt Shore, and now those who had learned that wealth, true wealth, was the kind you couldn't count in coins. When Maggie grew too old to tend the forge herself, she passed it to a boy named Jonas Vale. He'd been a wanderer, once rode through town looking for work, and left with something heavier than a wage purpose. The boy had a quick temper, quicker hands, and a hunger for something he couldn't name. But the day he touched that anvil for the first time, something inside him slowed. He said later it felt that the earth itself had reached up through his boots and told him to breathe. Jonas stayed. He wasn't much for talking, though. Folks said he carried the same fire Elias once did, quiet, steady, but fierce when tested. He kept the forge running, repairing plows, shoeing horses, and teaching young uns how to strike true without rushing. Sometimes, travelers from faraway cities would stop by, men in suits, looking for a legend they could sell or own. Must be worth a fortune, they'd say, nodding at the anvil. Jonas did smile, wipe his hands on a rag, and reply, it already is. He meant it every time. But this story ain't about Jonas alone. It about a woman who came to town one stormy spring. Her name was Clara Bell. She arrived on horseback, rain-soaked, coat torn, looking more ghost than guest. Folks at the tavern said she was a widow from back east, running from something heavy. When she walked into the forge that morning, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Jonas looked up from his work. "Help you, Mom?" She nodded, pulling a small lockbox from her satchel. "I need this open. Been trying for weeks, but the key gone." He took it gently, turning it in his hands. It was old iron and brass, tarnished by years of silence. "Looks personal," he said. "It is," she answered. "My husband. He left it behind when he passed. Told her not to open it till I was ready to start over. Thing is, I don't know what starting over means anymore." Jonas nodded, understanding more than he let on. "Reckon that's something you find out between one breath and the next." He set the box on the anvil and studied it. The lock was intricate but stubborn. He heated a pick in the forge, worked slow, letting the metal tell him what it wanted. When it finally clicked open, the lid rose with a soft sigh. like it had been waiting for that moment all along. Inside were two things, a full coin and a folded piece of paper. Clara frowned at it. Jonas handed her the note. She unfolded it carefully, hands trembling. The ink was faded, but the words were clear enough. If you're reading this, it means I ain't there to tell you myself. This coin is the first dollar we were made to get. Keep it, but don't spend it. Not 'cause it money, but 'cause it a reminder. Everything worth something starts small. Build slow, love slow, forgive quick. The voice cracked. He was a farmer. Always said money wasn't the measure of a man, but how he earned it was. Jonas looked at her, then at the envelope. Sounds like he knew what he was talking about. She smiled faintly. Guess so, I just forgot to listen. Jonas leaned on the workbench, eyes soft. World loud these days, hard to hear the things that matter. For a long moment, they just stood there, two souls adrift, finding anchor in the glow of the forge. Then Clara reached into her pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and set them beside the old one. Reckon I could do a reminder, too. You keep these, melt them down, pick something new, something that lasts. Jonas hesitated. Sure? She nodded. I'm sure, so he did. At night, thunder rolled and rain danced on the roof. Jonas melted those coins, her husband, his own spare change, and forged something he'd never made before, a bell. It was small, no bigger than a man's palm, but when he struck it, the sound was like nothing he'd heard, pure, mournful, alive. When Clara came back the next day, he handed it to her. Ain't much, but it made of pieces that mattered. She rang at once, tears glinting in her eyes. Sounds like remembering, she whispered. That the thing about remembering, Jonas said. You do it long enough, it starts turning into hope. She stayed in Crane Crossing after that, opened a small shop, made quilts, sold coffee, and kept that bell on the counter. Folks would ring it when they paid, not for change, but for gratitude. Said it made the day feel lighter, and over time they stopped calling it just the forge. They called it the anvil and the bell, a place where patience met memory and sorrow learned to hum again. Years drifted by tumbleweeds across the open plain, leaving Crane Crossing wrapped in the kind of peace most towns forget how to keep. The silver anvil still shone out front, and now the little bell, Clara Bell, left behind would chime soft every morning when the first breeze rolled through. It was said that between the two, the anvil and the bell, no man could enter the town without feeling a little lighter in his heart, a little quieter in his mind. Jonas' veil had grown gray around the temples by then. His hands were still strong, but his strikes were slower, more thoughtful. The forge didn't roar the way it once did. It breathed. He said that all a good life really was just one long, steady breath between the noise of birth and the silence of death. One day, a boy named Caleb Finn came wandering down from the hills, dust in his hair and a notebook under his arm. He'd heard stories about the forge, the kind of tales that city folk printed in papers with headlines like "The Town That Time Forgot." He was no blacksmith, not by a mile. He was a writer, thin and restless, chasing words the way a man chase storms. He found Jonas sitting by the forge door, whittling a stick into something that might have been a handle or maybe just nothing at all. "You the smith?" the boy asked. Jonas looked up, his eyes sharp, the kind reckon, "I still am." "Depends who asking." Caleb Finn, writer. "I'm here to learn about the silver anvil. They say it teaches people." Jonas chuckled, a low rumble like gravel under boots. "Teaching ain't in the evil, son. It in the listening. Folks come to me wanting magic, but they walk away realizing it was just work they've been running from." Caleb smiled faintly. "Work easy to talk about, hard to do." Jonas nodded. "You're half right. But it ain't the hammering that hard. It's the waiting between strikes." That line hit Caleb like a sermon. He wrote it down in his notebook before the words could slip away. "Mind if I stay a while? Maybe write about this place?" Jonas shrugged. "Forge don't mind company. Just don't try to explain it too quick. Words will spoil what silence already knows." So Caleb stayed. It slept in the loft, helped in the shop, and filled pages with sketches of the anvil, the bell, and the faces of the people who stopped by. He learned how to pump the bellows, how to tell when metal was ready by the color of its glow, and how to let the rhythm of his heart match the swing of the hammer. Weeks passed, and one night when rain was pouring like it meant to wash the world clean, Caleb finally asked the question that'd been gnawing at him since he arrived. "Jonas, why do people come to me? I mean, what do they really want?" Jonas paused mid-strike, looking into the fire. "Same thing everyone wants, peace that ain't borrowed, truth that don't rust." Caleb frowned. "And they find it here?" sometimes, but only if they stopped looking for it. Caleb set down his notebook. You would think of leaving? You could tell this story yourself. Write a book. The world could do the bit of what in this place. Jonas smiled, small and wistful. Ain't my job to tell it, son. My job to live it.
You make your tongue to me, though. What do they really want?
Jonas paused mid-strike, looking into the fire. Same thing everyone wants. Peace that ain't borrowed. Truth that don't rust. Caleb frowned. And they find it hid? Sometimes, but only if they stop looking for it. Caleb set down his notebook. You'd think of leaving? You could tell this story yourself. Write a book. The world could do the bit of what in this place. Jonas smiled, small and wistful. Ain't my job to tell it, son. My job to live it. Yours might be different. That night, the storm grew louder, thunder rolling across the plains like an old drum. But through it, the anvil rang, steady, soft, sure to fire. Caleb couldn't sleep. He sat up listening to that sound and realizing it was not that metal and hammer he was hearing. It was memory, legacy, the quiet courage of men who never quit even when no one was watching. By the time the storm passed, Caleb knew he wouldn't be staying much longer. His notebook was near full pages of reflections, sketches, and thoughts he didn't yet understand, but felt in his bones. When dawn came, he walked out to the silver anvil. The sunrise hit it fan fright, and for a moment it looked alive, like it was breathing the same air he was. He ran his fingers across the cold metal, whispering, "What are you? Really?" A voice came from behind him. It every man who hooked nothing and made something, Jonas said. It worked, made holy. Caleb turned, smiling. "I get it now." Jonas shook his head. "Son, you feel it? That difference?" When Caleb left town that afternoon, he didn't say goodbye proper, just tipped his hat and promised to send a copy of his book when it was done. He never did. But a year later, a parcel arrived by train. Inside was a small, leather-bound book titled The Anvil That Waits, the dedication read to the men and women who build slow, love honest, and strike true. "May your silence always sing," Jonas read it by lantern light that night, tears mixing with the soot on his hands. He placed the book on the shelf beside the bell, right under Elias Crane's old hammer, laughing. Years later, when Jonas passed, they found that same book still sitting there dusty, worn and bookmarked at one line that Ben underlined in a shaky hand. Patience is the language the universe uses to speak to those who listen, and that how the forge carried on. Not through gold, not through fame, but through the hearts it tempered. Decades drifted through Crane Crossing like the tide of a slow, steady river, quiet, certain, and unwilling to rush. By then, the forge had outlived every hand that once tended its flame. The anvil remained, still gleaming against time's steady wear, and the bell, Clara Bell, still hung beside the door, chiming soft whenever the wind remembered to whisper through the valley. Folks said the air itself learned to hum there, carrying echoes of old hammers and older hearts. When travelers passed through, they didn't find much to look at. The town had shrunk back into itself, just a scatter of buildings, a few lanterns hanging low, and the steady heartbeat of that old forge. Yet there was always someone who stayed. Someone new who didn't come to get rich, but to remember what rich truly meant. One such soul was Eli Turner. He was a banker's son from the coast, a place full of marble, glass, and people who smiled with their mouths but never with their eyes. His father ran a firm, mere numbers replaced names, and worth was measured in decimals. Eli grew up surrounded by wealth but starved of wisdom. When his father passed, leaving him a fortune that felt more like a burden, Eli found himself drifting. He packed a sin bag and left without telling anyone where he was going. 2 weeks later, he rode into Crane Crossing on a borrowed horse, drawn not by rumor but by an ache he couldn't name. He dismounted, tied the reins to the post, and stood in front of the silver anvil like a man facing his reflection for the first time. The air was warm with forge heat, and through the open door he saw a woman, broad-shouldered, salt-streaked, her hair tied back under a bandana. "You lost?" she asked, without looking up from her work. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I finally stopped running." She set the tongs aside and looked him over. "You talk like a man with too much thinking and not enough swinging," he smiled faintly. "That fair name Nora Vale," she said, extending a hand. "Jonas was my grandfather. Forge mine now, though I reckon it never really belongs to anyone. What brings you?" Eli looked at the anvil, gleaming beneath the soft glow of coals. "A question," he said simply. Nora leaned on her hammer. Then you'd best learn to earn the answer. And so he did. Eli stayed on as a helper, cleaning the forge, pumping the bellows, learning how to feel the weight of honest work. At first, his hands blistered, his back ached, and his mind screamed for the comfort of the life he'd left behind. But each night, sitting by the fire, he began to notice something, a stillness inside that hadn't been there before. The clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the smell of earth and smoke, all of it began to make sense. Not day labor, but the language. Weeks turned to months. He learned how steel softened under patience, how heat revealed truth, and how no good thing took less time than it needed. One evening, after a long day at the forge, he asked Nora, "Why do you keep doing this? This town ain't got riches, no customers worth the trouble." She lit up from her work, eyes steady. "'Cause money a fine servant and a rotten master. This place teaches the difference." Eli nodded, thinking on that for a long while. Later that night, he found himself sitting outside the forge, staring at the silver anvil. He pulled a small coin from his pocket, a coin his father once gave him. For luck, his father had said, though he'd never believed in such things. Eli rolled it between his fingers, staring at the way the moonlight caught its edges, and for the first time, he didn't see money. He saw metal. He stood, walked back inside, and dropped the coin into the coals. Nora glanced at him, but said nothing. When it glowed red, he lifted the hammer and brought it down. The first strike rang like thunder, sharp, uncertain, alive. He hit again and again, till the sound evened out into rhythm. Sweat poured down his face, tears maybe too, though the fire made it hard to tell. When he stopped, there on the anvil lay something unrecognizable, not a coin anymore, just a small bent piece of steel that'd forgotten what it used to be. He lit it, Nora. "Think it real?" She smiled slow. "No, son, think it free." From that day on, Eli never went back to the city. He stayed in Crane Crossing, learning not how to forge metal, but how to forge meaning. He started mending old farm tools, building new plows, teaching the young folk that wealth was just what you could hold without losing your soul. Years later, when he passed, folks found a note inside his chest pocket, folded neat, words written in careful hand. "My father left me a fortune, the anvil taught to what it was for." Below the note was a small, twisted piece of iron, the remnant of that melted coin. They buried him beside the others, under the same oak where Elias Crane once rested, where a Wyatt pocket watch still ticked beneath the soil. And when the wind blew that night, the bell above the forge rang without a hand touching it, soft, steady, like a whisper from the stars. Work honest, rest easy. And long after the fire died down, folks swear they could still hear the faint clang of hammer on steel, echoing through the hills, proof that patience, once learned, never dies. Years trickled past like sand through a cracked hourglass, and Crane Crossing became more memory than map. The railroad stopped running nearby, the post office closed, and travelers only came through when they were lost. But the forge still stood, unchanged, unyielding, humming with the ghosts of every hand that had struck a spark there. The roof had weathered storms and summers, and the anvil's shine had dulled to a quiet luster, the kind that cut only from age and truth. The bell still hung above the door, its tones softer now, worn thin by years of wind and wishing. Yet every time it rang, it sounded of belonging. Nora Vale had grown old by then, her back bent, pale, her hands stiff from decades of hammering, but her eyes still burned with that same silver flame that seemed to live in all who came through that place. The forge wasn't a business anymore. It was a beacon, a last light in a world too quick to forget what slow meant. She didn't take apprentices much these days, but one autumn, just as the leaves began to burn gold and the nights turned sharp, a young girl named June Hart arrived. She couldn't have been more than 16th in a fence post, hair tangled, and eyes that seemed too much too soon. She came carrying a small wooden box and a letter she never opened, said she'd heard about the forge from her grandfather, a farmer who'd once had his plow mended there. "Maya," she said softly, standing in the doorway, "I ain't looking for work, just a place to learn something that lasts." Nora looked at her a long moment before nodding toward the bell. "You hear that ring?" June tilted her head and the wind stirred. The bell gave a faint chime, sweet and lonely. "That means the forge is listening," Nora said. Go on, come inside, but June did. She swept the floors, polished the tools, and watched Abe. Nora worked. For weeks, she didn't touch a hammer, just listen, the way Jonas once told Caleb to. When Nora finally handed her the hammer, she said, "Ain't about strength, girl, it's about feel. Steel don't yield to muscle, it yields to respect." June bucked that to heart. Her first strikes were awkward, wild, uncertain, but the forge was patient. The fire taught her rhythm, the bell taught her humility, and the Evel taught her truth. Winter came early that year, and with it came silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to bend a man back. Nora fell ill, the fire burning low as she lay in bed with the wind howling outside. June tended to her, feeding the flames and reading old journals by lamplight entries from Elias Wyatt, Jonas, and even Eli Turner, each one talking about work, time, and the strange mercy of doing something the right way, even when no one watching. One night, when Nora's breath came slow and thin, she whipped June to her side. "You keep that fire going, girl," she whispered. "World colder than it used to be. Folks forget that light don't come from speed, it comes from care." June nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll keep it burning, Mom." Nora smiled faintly, reaching for her hand. "Then you'll do just fine," she passed before sunrise. When the townsfolk bathed, there wasn't much left of Crane Crossing worth mentioning. Just the forge, the Vivel, the bell, and the young girl who stood taller than her years beside the fire. They buried Nora under the same oak as the others. June hammered her name into a steel plaque with her own hands. The clangs echoed through the valley, each strike carrying a promise. After that, June took to running the forge herself. Folks came from miles around, drawn by curiosity, but they stayed for something else, peace. She never charged more than a man could afford, never turned away anyone who asked for help. Her work was slower, more deliberate. She made things that weren't meant to impress, but to endure. Tools, hinges, gates, lantern hooks. And sometimes, when the firelight caught her eyes just right, she looked like she'd been there forever. Like the forge itself had breathed her into being. Then one spring afternoon, a traveler stopped by, a photographer from the city. He'd heard tales about the forge that wouldn't die. He asked to take her work. June agreed, standing beside the anvil, sought on her face, bell overhead. When the flash went off, she didn't flinch, just smiled that quiet smile passed down through generations of patient souls. Weeks later, that photograph ended in a newspaper back east with the headline, "The Last Forge in America Still Burns." Letters poured in after that, students, dreamers, men tired of desks and clocks, all asking to come and learn, but June only in replied to one, and it was written in careful, uneven handwriting. You can't learn the forge by looking at it, you learn it by listening to what it don't say. Years turned into decades again. June grew old just as Nora had, and when she passed, folks said the forge went quiet for 3 whole days. No wind, no ring of the bell, no hum of heat. But on the 4th morning, the sun rose over the valley. The bell chimed once soft, sure, eternal. And though no one stood at the anvil, the air shimmered faintly, like a ghost of heat lingered there. Maybe memory, maybe something more. They say if you visit Crane Crossing now, you'll still find the forge. Empty, maybe, but not dead. The anvil waits, the bell still hangs, and if you sit quiet enough by the hearth, you can almost hear it, the slow, measured rhythm of a life well forged. It may be, just maybe, if the rain fall and gentle and your heart open wide enough, you'll hear the whisper that carried through 100 years of work and wisdom soft, a promise, steady at a heartbeat, build slow, love honest, forgive quick. Some say time has a way of burying what it can't understand. Whole towns vanish under dust and silence, dreams fade into photographs, and names become nothing but scratches on stones. Yet, as things, some truths, they don't die. They just wait. And out there, beyond the reach of roads, the forge waited too. Madame de Beluhart's hands went still. After her ashes joined the same earth that had held Elias Crane, Wyatt, Jonas, Nora, and Eli, the forge became part of the land itself. The anvil rusted soft on the edges, moss creeping up from the stone base. The bell tone deepened by rain and years. Travelers no longer came, not even wanderers. But one winter, when the wind howled through the valley like a ghost remembering its own name, a stranger stumbled in from the storm. His name was Rowan Dorsey. He wasn't from anywhere worth remembering. A drifter, a man whose eyes carried more storms than the sky. He'd once been a prospector, digging for gold in mountains that had long run dry. When the world turned hard on him, he turned harder. Lost friends, lost purpose, lost just about everything except the will to keep moving. That night, half frozen and starved, he saw a flicker through the snow, a light too steady to be lightning. He followed it through the storm and found the forge. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the place was dark, save for a faint glow from old coals that shouldn't have been burning. Dust lay thick on everything, but the air was warm alive. Rowan stood there, breath fogging in the light, and for the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't hunger or hate. He walked up to the anvil, laying a hand on the cold steel. "You still breathing, old thing," he muttered. The bell above the door gave a soft, accidental chime. He laughed, a rough, cracked sound. "Guess you are." Rowan spent the night there, fed by scraps from his pack and the comfort of a fire he coaxed back to life. But as he sat listening to the crackle, he started noticing things, tiny carvings in the beams, initials etched into the wall near the door. EC, WC, JV, NVJH names he didn't know, but names that meant something. He found an old chest near the corner, its hinges near rusted through. Inside lay journals, leather brittle with age. He opened one, squinting at the handwriting. "To woke is to pray without words." That line caught him. Or another entries from the old Smith, stories of hardship and patience, faith without sermon. He stayed up to dawn reading, and when the light hit the forge floor, he realized his hands had stopped shaking for the first time in years. The next day, he started cleaning. Didn't know why, didn't need to, just felt right. He swept the floor, oiled the tools, even polished the old anvil. Then he took a piece of scrap metal from the chest, set it on the surface, and struck it with the old hammer. The sound rang through the empty valley, bouncing off the hills like an echo of the past. That leg strike changed him. He stayed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He mended old nails, reforged horseshoes, built hinges for doors that long fallen off. Travelers started hearing about him, a ghost smith, they said, a man who worked for nothing but food and the store you brought with you. Each night, Rowan would sit by the fire, read another page from the journals. He learned about Elias Crane and his belief that work was holy, about Wyatt, who found freedom in patience, about Jonas, who taught silence to sing, about Nora June, who kept the light alive when the world had gone dim. It was like every name carved into those walls became a voice whispering in his ear, telling him he wasn't lost, just unfinished. One spring, a boy passed through the valley, no older than 12, with hands blistered from working a mine that barely paid him. He came to Rowan asking for a knife. Rowan looked at him and said, "You don't need a knife, son. You need a start." He handed him a small, dull piece of iron. "Make it sharp yourself. I'll show you how." The boy learned quick. His strikes rough at first, but steadying over time. When he finished, he held up the blade, grinning, "Unperfect," he said. Rowan smiled. Nothing worth keeping there. His word spread again, slow but sure. More folks came. Some stayed for a day, others for a year. They didn't call it Crane Crossing anymore, just the forge. And once again, the valley had a heartbeat. Before long, Rowan's beard went white, his hands thick and scarred. But every day he still struck the evel once at dawn and once before dusk. He said it was his way of keeping time with the world, and when his final winter came, he sat by the fire, the same journals open in his lap. He smiled at the empty room, whispering, "Guess I found what I was digging for after I..." When they found him the next morning, the forge was cold, but the anvil somehow was warm, and inside the last page of June Hart Old Ledger, they found a single line written in shaky handwriting that wasn't of hers. Some fires don't need wood, they burn in the hands that remember. The bell above the door rang once more, carried by the gentlest wind, and the valley, quiet, timeless, breathed again. And that how it been since. No matter who comes or goes, no matter how many winters pass, that devil waits. For the next soul tired of noise, hungry for truth. For the next wanderer looking not for gold, but for grace. Because somewhere in the hush between hammer and steel, the old forge still whispers, "The world don't owe you peace. You gotta forge it yourself." Years drifted by slow smoke over the hills, and the forge became legend and told in whispers and half-remembered tales by travelers huddled near roadside fires. Some swore the bell still rang before storms, as if warning the valley to brace itself. Others claimed to have seen a figure inside the forge on moonless nights, white-bearded, slow-moving, his hammer rising and falling in rhythm with the rain. But those who went to see found nothing but ash, dust, and that impatient Tenville sitting like it had all the time in the world. It might have stayed that way forever, if not for a young man named Sam Holland. Sam came from a line of men who worked themselves into the ground. His daddy drove trucks cross-country, his granddad ran cattle till the plains ran dry, and his great-granddad mined coal until the company forgot his name. Sam didn't want any of it. He grew up in a world that promised fast fortunes, faster fame, stock apps, crypto, influencers, hollow words about hustle and grind. He had all the noise, but none of the silence. One night, sitting in a cheap motel room with the rain hitting the window and debt stacking higher than his hope, he found an old article online, "The last forge in America still burns." It was yellowed and scanned, dated nearly 80 years back. But there it was, the photo of June Hart beside her Edville, eyes shining the embers. Something about it stopped him cold. Read the article twice, 3 times, each line felt like it had been written for him, though the writer was long gone. By sunrise, Sam packed what little he had and left. He didn't tell a soul, didn't even know exactly where he was heading, just west, following old rail maps and ghost stories till his tires found dirt roads and his phone lost signal. 3 days later, he reached the valley. It was smaller than he expected, quieter too. The grass had grown high around the forge and the roof leaned under its own weight, but the miffle stood there still, stubborn in time. He pushed open the door and dust fell like a curtain between centuries. For a long time, Sam just stood there. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a smith, didn't even know how to light a proper fire, but he set his backpack down, rolled up his sleeves, and started cleaning. He swept out years of silence, wiped the soot from the bell, and set about patching what he could. He found the old journals, too. Jonah's careful words, Eli reflections, June's script, neat and tender. Read them by flashlight until dawn, his heart beating in rhythm with each page. Something in him began to thaw. He made a habit of talking to the forge like it was an old friend. Told it about the city, the false starts, the noise, the kind of loneliness that follows you even when you're surrounded. And sometimes, when he finished talking, the bell would ring soft, like the wind was answering back. Weeks passed, and Sam tried his hand at smithing. It was clumsy work at first, his swings wild, his timing off, but he learned, day by day, mistake by mistake, until the steel started responding. He learned that heat wasn't about anger, it was about patience. The locals from a nearby town began to notice the smoke again, rising thin and steady over the ridge. Curiosity brought them up the trail farmers, wanderers, a single mother looking to fix her son's bike chain. They found Sam there, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened, eyes brighter than they'd been in years. "You do repairs?" one of them asked. Sam smiled. "Don't know if I do 'em right yet, but I'll sure hell try." And that's how it began again. Fixed more than tools, you fixed trust. Folks started coming not for mended metal, but for the stillness that hung in the air there. It wasn't a business, it was a refuge. By the second summer, the forge was alive once more. Sam hung an old sign over the door that read, "Time, Fire, and Patience." All things worth waiting for, didn't charge much, just enough to keep the lights on and the fire fed. Some folks paid with food, and with stories. One old rancher wore a cracked silver pocket watch that'd been in his family for 100 years. "Doesn't tick no more," the man said. Sam took it, nodding slow. Neither did this place, months. He spent days working on that watch, polishing gears, rebuilding springs, studying how the pieces talked to each other. And when he was done, it ticked again, soft, steady, proud. The old rancher cried, "How'd you do it?" Sam smiled. "Didn't fix it, just reminded it what it was for." Word spread, as it always does. Before long, artists came, teachers came, even a few folks from the city who'd heard about the young man who brought the forge back. But Sam didn't care for fame. He kept his head down, letting his work speak louder than any story, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the forge was teaching him just as much that he was mending it. Some nights, sitting by the coals, he'd swear he saw shapes in the heat, faint outlines of faces, hands at work, hammers rising and falling in slow rhythm. He never told anyone, though, just smiled and said to the dark, "Guess I ain't working alone." By the time another decade passed, the valley had changed again. A small trail town had grown near the old river bend, and they named it Holler Rest. Folks said it was built on patience and the sound of steel singing at dusk. Sam never took credit. He just kept working, letting the fire do what it always did best, turn the broken into the beautiful. And when he finally grew too old to swing the hammer, he left a note beside the echo. Just a sill line carved deep into the steel don't rush the miracle. When the next traveler found it years later, they didn't ask who wrote it. They didn't need to. The forge spoke for itself, and so it burned on and on through the years, no matter the names or hands that kept it alive, because subfires don't die. They would wait for the next fool brave enough to believe in them. When the first chill of autumn rolled back into Holler Rest, the valley had grown into something else entirely. The forge still stood at its heart, but around it now was a living rhythm homes with smoke curling from chimneys, a market that came alive every Sunday, and a school built from lumber Sam had cut himself. Folks said they could still hear the echo of hammers in the wind even when no one was swinging one. The forge had become more than a workshop. It was the town pulse. Children ran tanded on their way to lessons. Old men leaned on the fence to trade stories, and wind came with broken pots or memories that needed mending. Fire inside glowed steady, not bright, but faithful. It remembered every pair of hands that coaxed it back to life. By now, Sam Beard had gone all silver, and his shoulders had softened, but he still moved with purpose. His hammer lay quiet most days, replaced by the rhythm of his words. He taught others what the forge had taught him, how to wait, how to shape, how to listen. He'd taken on an apprentice, a quiet boy named Miles, who didn't say much but carried a heart full of wonder. Miles had been found wandering near the rail tracks after his folks moved on, looking for a place that would let him stay. The forge had a habit of finding lost souls, and when Sam saw him standing there in the doorway, eyes wide-eyed moonlight, he just said, "You hear that bell, boy? That means she's saying yes." Miles didn't know what that meant, not then, but he learned fast. Each day, he'd sweep the ashes, pump the bellows, and watch Jen. Sam showed him how to breathe life back into the cold. "You ain't fighting the steel," Sam would say. "You're guiding it." Same way the good Lord guides a stubborn fool firm but patient. Over time, the boy's strikes grew steady. His mistakes turned into lessons, his lessons into craft. He made hinges that didn't squeak, nails that never bent, and one day, without meaning to, he made a blade that shined like sunrise. Sam held it up to the light and smiled. "There it is," he said softly, "your first truth." That night, the two of them sat by the fire, the air humming with crickets and memory. Miles finally spoke. "Why do you call it truth, sir?" "Ain't it just a knife?" Sam chuckled low. "Maybe to A, but truth ain't in what you did, boy, it in how you made it. You can tell a man's heart by how he treats, but don't talk back." Miles nodded, staring into the fire, trying to catch the meaning the way smoke catch light. As years passed, Miles grew taller, stronger. Sam grew slower, softer, but neither lost that steady rhythm between them, the Vedval song that kept time with their hearts. Then one winter, Sam took sick. He didn't complain, didn't quit. Just said the forge had taught him enough, and it was time to let the fire teach someone new. He hopped Miles to his bedside one cold morning, the frost still clinging to the windows. "Boy," he rasped, "I reckon this place ain't mine no more. It's yours now." Miles shook his head, tears in his eyes. "I can't, sir. I ain't ready." Sam smiled, his voice thin in smoke. "None of us are. The trick ain't being ready, it's just beginning." He reached under his pillow and pulled out that same silver pocket watch, the one he'd once fixed for the old rancher years ago. Its tick was faint but steady. "Keep time with this," he said. "And when you can't hear it no more, don't be sad. It just means it's time to listen to something else." That night, as the wind rose and the bell over the door gave one last gentle chime, Sam Holler drifted into sleep he didn't wake from. The forge went cold for 3 days. Then on the 4th morning, Miles struck the anvil once. The sound was pure, deep, and carried through every home in Holler Rest. Folks stopped what they were doing, farmers, merchants, children, and listened. The valley seemed to breathe again. From that day on, the forge belonged to Miles, though he never called it his. He said it still belonged to every soul who'd have laid a hand on it. He carved a small sign into the wooden beam above the doorway. For those who lost their way, there's still light in the coals. And in years stretched into decades, that light never dimmed. Travelers still came through, each one drawn not by maps or money, but by something deeper, stories whispered by those who passed through before. And when they arrived, they'd find a quiet man, gay at the temples, hammering slow and true. He never rushed, never sold his work for fame. When asked how he kept the fire going all those years, he'd just smile and say, because it mine to borrow, not mine to own. And maybe that's the real secret, one passed down from Elias Crane to Wyatt, to Jonas, to Nora, to June, to Rowan, to Sam, and now to Miles. That wealth ain't in what you keep, it in what you continue. So when the storms rolled through and the years grew heavy, the forge still burned, and somewhere, deep in the heart of that valley, if you listen real close, you could still hear a hammer falling slow and steady, like a heartbeat that never learned how to quit. Time moved on like the long roll of a fiddle played at dusk. A steady, mournful but kind holler rest grew older, its fences wider, its people wiser, and its nights softer under the glow of oil lamps and ember light. Miles had turned from a boy to a man to a teacher, and from a teacher to a legend folks didn't dare to put in words. By then his hair had gone the color of cooled steel, and his hands looked like river stones, scarred strong and smoothed by years of honest work. He never married, though folks often asked why. He'd just smile, lean back in his chair, and say, already got a partner, don't talk much, but sure keeps me warm. Then he'd nod toward the forge, and everyone would laugh, though the truth of it wasn't lost on any of them. He'd become the keeper of not up the fire, but the story of the fire. And he told it the same way Sam once had, quietly, slowly, with pauses that let the wind slip between the words. He'd tell of Elias Crane and his belief that work was holy, of Wyatt's stubborn hope, Jonas' silence, Nora grace, June fire, Rowan redemption, and Sam patience. He didn't tell it to impress. He told it so no one would forget. Some nights, travelers would stay after sundown, sitting cross-legged on the forge floor while rain pattered on the roof. Miles would feed the coals, then talk about what money really was. Not bills or coins or ledgers, but faith, faith in yourself, faith in tomorrow, faith that your effort meant something even when no one was watching. Truth is, he'd say, every swing of the hammer a promise, not to anyone else, just to you, that you'll keep striking till the shape shows itself. One of those nights, a young woman named Clara Vane came riding through the valley. She wasn't like most travelers, didn't look lost, didn't look desperate. She was sharp-eyed, dressed in worn city clothes, with a sachet full of ledgers and a pocket calculator she carried like a charm. Said she worked for a bank, the kind that lent big and forgot bigger. But she wasn't there for business. She was there for peace. Her voice trembled when she spoke to Miles that first evening. My life been nothing but numbers, she said. Profits, margins, loans, debts. I know how to count everything except the things that matter. Miles nodded slow, poking at the coals. Fire don't care what you done or where you're from. It just wants truth. You got any of that left? Clara looked down, her eyes glinting with reflection. I think I do, she whispered. He handed her a pair of tongs and a hammer. Then start there. At first, she swung like the city had taught her, fast, anxious, hungry for results. The steel fought back, bent wrong, cracked at the edge. But Miles didn't correct her right away. He let her fail, let her feel the sting. Then, when the noise died down, he said, you're hitting too hard for something that ain't running away. That line stuck with her. Days turned into weeks, and Clara stayed on. She learned the rhythm of the forge, how to listen to the sound of her own patience. At night, she'd write notes in a little journal, lessons not about finance, but about fire. The flame rewards respect, she wrote, not greed. You can't rush what needs time to become. Miles would watch her from the doorway, proud but quiet, the same way Sam once had. You remind me of June, he'd say sometimes. Fire in your soul, but grace in your hands. She smiled at that, though she didn't know who June was until she found the old journals. Then he read every word. When spring rolled in, Clara had made her first real piece, a small iron bowl with edges so even you could balance a coin on it. She didn't sell it. She filled it with river stones and set it by the Edward. For those who forget where they started, she said. That summer, she told Miles she was leaving.
I've got to go back, she said, but not to count numbers anymore. I want to teach people what you taught Ted, that patience compounds just like money.
Maybe faster, Miles smiled, handing her a small pouch of coal dust. Then take this. When life gets too loud, burn it slow, and remember what silence sounds like. She hugged him before she rode off, leaving a trail of dust that shimmered in the dawn light. Years later, letters started coming from all over, students from the city, townsfolk from across the plains, even bankers and factory hands. They wrote about workshops and schools named the Quiet Ledger, the Fire Fund, the Crane Academy. Clara had carried the forge into a new kind of world, one made of spreadsheets and skyscrapers, but still hungry for warmth. Miles kept those letters in a box under his cot. On nights when the rain came soft and steady, he'd read them by lamplight, smiling that slow, peaceful smile of a man who knew he'd done his part. When his final winter came, Miles didn't tell anyone. He just closed the forge one evening, sat beside the fire and listened to the wind whisper through the cracks. He didn't feel alone. He saw them all. Elias, Wyatt, Jonas, Nora, June, Rowan, Sam, and Clara standing around him in the glow. Not ghosts, but echoes. Not lost, but alive in every swing the bell was, every lesson it learned. He whispered, I kept it burning. Lake, you asked. And then, with the softest sigh, the hammer fell from his hand. But the forge didn't go dark. When morning came, the bell rang again, gentle, clear, patient, and down in Holler Rest, a small group of children followed the sound to the forge, where they found the coals still warm and a new journal on the bench. Its first line read, Fire is a language that never forgets who taught it to speak. So, the forge waited once more, for the next soul, with steady hands and a restless heart. The forge waited longer this time. Seasons spun their circles, summer gold, autumn rust, winter white, spring green, and still it stood. The bell above the doorway rusted to a low hum, and the roof sagged under years of rain. But the heart of the lace, the coals beneath the ash, never truly went cold. When the night was still and the moon rode high, a faint glow would still be seen from the ridge, like an old heartbeat that refused to quit. Down in Holler Rest, life kept moving. The small town that had once been a Fid forge now hummed with shops, families, and laughter. Folks sold hand-forged goods in the square, and every child knew to bow their head when they passed the hill where the fire still slept. But then came a new storm. Not of rain, but of time. The world beyond the valley had changed faster than most had followed. Machines began to hum louder than hammers, lights burned longer than lamps, and work that once took sweat and stillness could now be done by screens and buttons. The forge, once a symbol of strength and patience, became a whisper of the past. Folks still honored it, sure, but only the way you honor a photograph. They'd visit, nod respectfully, and move on. Until one day a stranger arrived, a man in his 30s named Cole Danner. He wasn't from anywhere near, and yet the townsfolk said he carried the valley's silence in his eyes. He came driving a truck older than himself, the kind that coughed smoke and rattled with every mile. Said he worked in the city once, building things that didn't last, apps, systems, data sheets, made more money than sense, he joked, though his laugh was tired. When asked what brought him out dead, he said Donan needed to remember what effort feels like. That night he climbed the hill. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and rain, and the forge loomed like a memory waiting to be remembered. He found the journal Miles had left, pages yellowed, corners curled. The ink had faded, but the message hadn't fused. Fire remembers hands that believed in it. He set his pack down and sat in silence. He didn't try to light anything, not yet. Just listen, the way all the others had before him. It took him 3 days to clean the place up, one board at a time. He patched the roof, scrubbed the soot, and rebuilt the bellows from scraps he found behind the old stable. When he finally lit the first spark, it almost didn't catch. The wood was damp, the coal reluctant. But then, just as he was about to give up, a breeze slipped through the doorway, soft of breath, and the flame flared to life. Cole smiled, the kind of smile a man gives when he's seen a ghost that means him no harm. He didn't know how to forge. Not real, but he learned fast. He burned his hands, broke his first anvil, and ruined more steel than he saved. But every mistake sang back at him. Every failure had its lesson. By the second winter, he was making tools at Swede. Cole smiled and kind of smile a man gives. Well, he was singing those means of no harm. He didn't know how to forge, not rope, but he learned fast. He burned his hands, broke his first anvil, and ruined more steel than he saved. But every mistake sang back at him. Every failure had its lesson. By the second winter, he was making tools at Swede. He brings him I didn't know how to forge, not rope, but he learned fast. He burned his hands, broke his first anvil, and ruined more steel than he saved. But every mistake sang back at him. Every failure had its lesson. By the second winter, he was making tools at Cleveland, and at clockwork, folks started coming. At first, it was curiosity just to see who'd be fool enough to bring back a forge in a world that didn't need one. Then it was respect when they saw the care he took, the patience in his craft. Then it was gratitude when they realized he wasn't selling anything, he was giving it. He refused money, said it made things feel smaller. Instead, he traded for stories, one tale for one tool he'd tell folks. A widow came with a broken locket, told him it was all she had left of her husband, who'd worked the rails before the line shut down. Cole melted the clasp, reforged the loop, and handed it back. "It'll hold now," he said. She left behind a story about their first night under the stars. A boy came with a cracked horseshoe.
Said it was from a fairground pony that taught him not to be afraid. Cole mended it, polished it, and nailed it above the forge door. "Luck don't vanish," he said. "It just waits for notice." Each trade left a mark, stories carved into the beams, etched into the walls, burned into memory.
The forge became a museum of souls, every object holding the weight of someone who dared to care. And one day, while hammering out a plowshare for a farmer, Cole found himself humming low, steady. Oh, he'd heard the tune before. It took him a while to realize what it was. It was the rhythm of the forge song, the same cadence that Elias, Wyatt, Nora, June, Sam, Miles, all of them had once kept. He froze mid-swing, the hair on his arms rising. Then he smiled. "Guess you're still ill, huh?" He whispered to the Coles. The bell rang once. He didn't touch it. Didn't have to. From then on, the forge felt alive again. Not haunted, not holy, just present. It was a place where time didn't rush and where hands still mattered. And though the rest of the world had moved on to buttons and circuits, in that valley, folks still believed in hammers, in waiting, in work that sang. As years passed, Cole grew older. His beard thickened, his eyes softened. He taught others, same as Sam once had. Not lessons in fire, but in faith. Every spark of decision, he'd tell his students. And the hardest part of wealth is learning what kind to keep. By the time his hair turned gay, Hollow Rest had become a place of pilgrimage. They didn't come for religion, or profit, or fame. They came for quiet. Because sometimes the richest sound in the world is a hammer falling slow in the rain. And when Cole finally laid his hammer down for the last time, the forge didn't fade. It burned on, steady, patient, alive, as if it knew the cycle would begin dead. Because that's what truth does. It waits for someone stubborn enough to hear it again. The forge didn't just live, it breathed. Long after Cole Danner hands had stilled, long after the last echoes of his hammer faded into the valley air, there remained that pulse, a deep, unseen rhythm that hummed beneath the floorboards, beneath the soil, beneath the memory of the place. Some said it was the wind, others swore it was the earth itself, remembering the men and women who had once bent their will against the cold. But those who stayed long enough knew better. The forge had a soul, and it kept its own kind of time. When word spread that Cole had passed, folks came from all over, farmers, travelers, even city folk in pressed coats. who didn't know what to do with their hands when they weren't holding a phone. As at the base of the hill, hats off, heads bowed, while rain fell soft, dead, whispered prayers. There wasn't no preacher, no sermon, just a fire burning steady in the forge, fed by a few pieces of wood each person had carried up the hill themselves. It burned for 7 days. No one tended it. No one had to. After that, the forge went quiet again, or so it seemed. But a quiet forge in holler rest is never truly empty. Not long after cold passing, a girl came wandering through. Couldn't have been more than 12, hair tangled, boots too big, with a sachet slung over her shoulder that looked older than she was. Her name was Etta Crane. When the townsfolk heard that name, they looked at one another, half smealing, half stunned. Crane, they said, ain't that the same amps? She nodded. Elias was my great-great-granddad. At least that what Ma told they. She didn't come looking for pity. She came with a purpose. Said her ma had passed on a letter before she died, one written by her grandfather, Verso, folded so many times it looked like it had been waiting to be opened for 100 years. She climbed that hill and stood before the forge, hands shaking, letting in. She read it out loud to the coals that hadn't burned in months. To whoever finds this place when I'm gone, know that what you seek ain't gold nor land nor fame. It's the way to work made honest. If you can't find it in the world, you'll find it right here in the sound of a hammer waiting to be swung. The wind shifted then. The bell rang once. Etta dropped to her knees, laughing and crying all at once. Hey, yes, that means I'm home, she whispered. That night she slept on the forge floor, same as Sam once had, same as Cole. The next morning she went down to town, traded her satchel of trinkets for the coal and a set of tools, and got to work.
Now, she wasn't no smith. Not at first, but she had a stubborn streak wider than the valley itself. She studied old books, listened to old-timers, and burned her share of fingers before the first spark caught right. When it did, though, something in her eyes changed. It was that look all the others had carried. That soft, sure light of belief. The townsfolk started calling her Little Fire. She hated it at first, but soon grew into the name. Etta wasn't not good, she was gifted. She had a feel for metal like it was alive. She'd touch a bar of iron and say, "This one a knife," or "This one wants to be a gate." Folks didn't question her. They just watched as her hands turned raw ore into beauty. She never charged much. Often she didn't charge at all. Like Cole before her, she'd trade her work for stories. But she added something new. She wrote those stories down. Every one of them filled books with names, dates, and the kind of details most folks forget. She said no story deserved to fade just 'cause the teller did. By her 3rd year at the forge, she'd filled 7 ledgers.
And in the 8th, she started reading her own. She wrote about how the world outside had turned to glass and wire, how money moved faster than thought, how folks built fortunes they didn't understand and lost M. Mendez quick. She wrote about her own wander and the hunger that brought her here, and how a single line in a letter changed her life. She ended that entry with, "The world may run on speed, but value still listens to patience." Before long, word spread, not that through the valley this time, but far beyond. Writers came recording her words, filmmakers too, trying to capture the glow of that forge on camera. She never turned them away, but she never performed for them either. The flame don't dance for coin, she'd say. It dances for truth. And though her fame grew, Etta stayed small in her heart. She never left the valley. She said every journey she needed to take was already in the fire. The people of Holler Rest followed her lead. They stopped building bigger, stopped chasing farther. They started tending to what they had each other, their work, their stories. The forge became a schooling this time, not yet for smithing, but for living. Etta would stand before her students, hair tied back, sat on her cheek, and say, "You ain't here to learn how to make things. You're here to learn how not to rake yourself." She taught that money was a mirror. It shows what you are, not what you want to be. She taught that patience compounds faster than interest. You can't rush a tree to grow, nor a man to understand. She taught that legacy ain't about who remembers your name. It's about what still works after you're gone. One night, after a long day at the ashram, she sat outside under the stars. The valley was quiet except for the low hum of the forge. She opened the old letter again, traced the faded ink, and whispered, "Reckon we did it, Granddad. Reckon the work's still good." Then they smiled, closed her eyes, and listened to the sound the world makes when it's finally at peace with itself. The forge burned through the night, and down the valley every lamp flickered once, as if the whole town was breathing in rhythm with the fire. Years drifted on, the way a river bends slow through the lowlands, never stopping to change in shape with the land that holds it. Holler Rest wasn't much to look at on a map, but stories had a way of stretching farther than fences. Etta Crane's name became one of those stories folks told in soft voices when the world out got too loud, like a prayer or a song without words. The forge still burned day and night. Etta tended it like a heartbeat, keeping it steady through flood, frost, and time. As though she aged as all who love long and work hard eventually do, her hands never lost that steady rhythm, that patience only born from seeing enough years to know hurry a thief that steals from grace. One autumn evening, long after the harvest, a traveler came riding into the valley. His name was Warren Pike, though no one knew it yet. He was tall, wiry, with a coat that had seen too many miles and a face half hidden behind a beard the color of old ash. He didn't come with goods or purpose, just the look of a man running from something that used to meet everything. Found Etta forged him before dusk, when the last light still kissed the anvil gold. She looked up from her work. He stepped into the doorway, rainwater dripping from his hat brim. Evening, she said, weeping sweat from her brow. He nodded, eyes catching on the glow of the coals. Didn't reckon I'd find fire this far out. She smiled. Fire finds you, not the other way round. He chuckled at that. First time he'd laughed in months. You sound like my grandmother. Then she must have been a wise woman. Or stubborn, he said. Setting his pack down, hard to tell the difference sometimes. Etta poured him a tin of coffee and sat across from him while the forge hummed low between them. They didn't speak for a long while, just listened to the fire breathe. Finally she asked, you looking to make something or to remember how? He took a slow sip, staring at the sparks that drifted up but lost thoughts. Neither. I've already made my fortune, lost it too. Guess I came to see if there's something left worth building. Etta studied him quiet for a moment. Then she said, the only things worth building don't fit in ledgers. That night Warren stayed by the forge, slept on the same floor that Sam, Cole, and Etta herself had once rested on. When morning came, he offered to help, though he admitted he didn't know one end of a hammer from the other. Didn't matter. Etta handed him a broom. Start with clearing the dust. Most folks don't realize the world built on small beginnings. He swept that forge floor till his back ached and his arms trembled, but by sundown, the place gleamed. Something in him had loosened. He stayed a week, then a month, then a season, and in that time, he learned how to listen again, to steel, to silence, to himself. He learned the language of rhythm and heat, the art of waiting for the right color of metal before swinging down. He learned that craft ain't about control, it's about surrender. By the time spring came, he'd made his first true piece, a simple, rough-edged horseshoe. He set it on the wall beside Etta's old ledger and grinned at a boy who'd caught lightning in his hands. This worth anything? He asked. Etta ran her thumb along the curve of it. Depot what you traded? To make it, he thought about that all night. When morning came, he said, I reckon I'd like to stay a while. Then stay, she said. But only if you learn to teach when you're done learning, he promised he would. Years rolled by like wagon wheels over wet clay, and Warren Pike became the valley no-keeper. Etta hair turned silver Ed Frost, but her fire never dimmed. Together they worked side by side, her at the evel, him at the ledger, their rhythms blending like two steady heartbeats. They didn't talk much about money, but they lived the kind of wealth no bank could measure. They built tools, yes, but they also built a life that hummed with purpose. And when Etta's final day came, she didn't go quietly. She worked till dusk, forged one last blade, a small knife with a handle made from walnut wood, and handed it to Warren for cutting through noise, she said with a grin. Laughed through tears. You sure you don't want to rest now? She nodded toward the fire. Rest is for when the flame forgets who it is. And that night the rain came down gentle on the roof. Etta sat in her chair by the forge and closed her eyes. She went peaceful, the kind of peaceful you'll earn by living exactly how you meant to. When the sun rose, Warren lit the fire again. It burned high and bright, too bright for you. Folks in town swore they saw shapes in the smoke that looked like hands, like hammers, like wings. He didn't argue. He knew better than to explain miracles. And though her body rested in the hillside beside the others, her spirit lived on in the sound of that flame, whispering through the metal every time the hammer fell. Warren kept her forge alive. He wrote her name in every ledger first line for the woman who taught patience to the flame, and every soul who came through Holler Rest from then on left carrying more than they broke, because once you hear truth in fire, you can't unhear it. It stays with you, in your hands, in your work, in your quiet moments when the rain hits the roof and you remember what wealthly means. Years trickled on like whiskey through an old oak barrel, slow rich, gathering depth with every season. The forge remained where it always had, sitting proud atop the hill, as though time itself bent around it. Warren Pike grew older, but never slower. His beard turned silver, his shoulders broadened with the weight of earned years, and the lines on his hands read like maps of all the choices he hammered into shape. He never taught himself master, though most would have given him that title without question. He said he was just another fool lucky enough to hear the fire talk back, and about knowing how to forge, he'd tell the young ones who came from faraway towns it about remembering that every piece of metal already got a story. You're just helping it find its voice. The town had changed again, though not like the world outside. In Holler Rest, money didn't rule. Folks traded work, trust, and time instead. A baker bread was worth a carpenter bench. A doctor's stitch could be repaid with a plowshare. No one kept books, but no one went hungry neither. It was Warren who started what folks began calling the Day of Hands. Once a year, on the anniversary of Etta passing, everyone would put down what they were doing and gather in the square. No speeches, no music, just silence. Then, one by one, they'd walk up the hill and lay something they made by hand at the foot of the forge. Could be anything, a carving, a loaf, a letter, even a handful of dirt from a field that had been good that season. By sundown, the hill would be covered with offerings, glimmering gold and rust and sweat under the firelight. No one touched the pile till dawn. When morning came, Warren would carry every piece inside, thank the fire, and melt a few down, not to destroy them, but to fold them into something new. A ring, a nail, a hinge, whatever the forge wanted that year. Then he'd say, "This here proof the world still believes in what can't be bought." That ring of melted offerings became Holler Rest Heart. It hung above the forge door, never polished, always burnished by time. As the years rolled further, Warren's eyes began to fade, but his memory sharpened. He could tell the weight of a nail bit by touch, the strength of a flame bit by scent. Folks said he could hear when steel was telling the truth. One winter, when snow sat thick and heavy, a young woman from the city came knocking at the forge door. She wore a coat finer than any cloth seen in the valley, but her face carried the same tired ache that had once lived in Warren's own eyes. "Sir," she said softly, "I was told this place makes things that last." Warren smiled. "We try. Depends what you bring with you." She hesitated before opening her sachets. Inside was a small glass cube, flickering faintly with blue light. "It a memory box," she said. "Holds my family recordings." But the drive died. The world moved on from this sort of thing, and I can't let him fade. Warren turned the cube over in his palm. "You want me to fix something that ain't meant to be dead?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know how to remember them without it." He nodded slow. "Then maybe what you need ain't fixing, maybe it rebuilding." She stayed the night by the forge, watched him disassemble the little cube, hands moving gentle ains if cradling a baby bird. Inside, where others would seen circuits and code, Warren saw something else, a vessel, waiting to be given form. He melted a bit of old silver from Etta ring, folded it into the cube code, and when it cooled, he whispered, "Fire remembers what given to it honest." When he handed it back, it no longer glowed. It pulsed slow, like a heart. "What did you do?" she asked. "Didn't do nothing that wasn't already there," he said. "It'll fade, same may all things, but every time you touch it, you'll remember the feeling, not just the pit." She pressed it to her chest and cried. Before she left, she wrote a note in Warren's ledger. "He didn't restore my memories. He reminded me how to keep them." Warren never forgot her. And his years grew long. He began to realize what the forge truly was. It wasn't a place for making tools or fixing trinkets. It was a sanctuary for the weary, a place where those who lost their way could trade their burden for silence. Every person who came up that hill brought a story, and every story left a trace. When he lay awake at night, Warren could hear them moan, whispering, Elias, Wyatt, Nora, June, Sam, Miles, Cole, Etta, all their voices humming through the rafters, mingling with the wind. One evening a storm rolled in, the kind that shakes the bones of the mountains. Warren knew what it meant. He sat by the fire, stared into the flame till his reflection blurred, and said, "Guess it's my turn to rest, huh?" The fire crackled once. He smiled. "Didn't figure I'd outlast so many good folks, but I'll be damned if I don't go with the heat." He stoked the forge one last time, pressed his hand against the evel, and closed his eyes. When the storm broke, lightning struck the ridge, lightened the sky brighter than noon. The next morning, townsfolk climbed the hill, expecting ruin, but the forge stood untouched. The anvil glowed faintly, warm to the touch, and the hammer lay across it, burnished, not blackened. The fire was gone, but the coals were still hot. Someone whispered, "He ain't gone. He waitin'," and that what they chose to believe. They kept the forge sealed for a season, not out of fear, but out of respect. Then one spring night, a boy not older than 16 crept up the hill, his father broken knife in hand. He pushed open the door, took a breath, and whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I reckon I'll learn." The coals flared. He smiled. And so the story started dead, because that what the forge was never meant to end, it was meant to begin over and over with whoever was brave enough to believe in their own two hands. By the time the boy had grown into a man, the forge had long since woven itself into the rhythm of holler rest. The seasons came and went, each one worked not by calendars, but by the sound of a hammer against iron echoing up the valley at dusk. The world beyond the mountains had changed near beyond recognition. Cities had become lights that never slept, and folks lived by screens instead of stars. But here the fire still breathed, slow and sure. That boy name was Levi Pike, Warren grandson, though few in town still used the surname. He had been raised among stories, not sermons, and from the time he could walk, he'd follow the old man shadow up that hill every morning, watching, listening, learning. Warren never gave him easy lessons. The first year, he didn't let Levi touch a hammer. "You got to learn to listen before you strike," he'd say, setting a hand on the boy's shoulder. So Levi swept the floor, fed the fire, fetched coal from the shed, and stared into that glow until he swore he could see shapes in it ghosts of all who came before. He grew patient, which was the first thing the forge demanded of any man. When Warren passed, he did so without ceremony, just a soft sigh and a smile that he sat by the coals. Levi found him there, still warm, eyes half open, as if looking past the walls to that place he'd always known was waiting. The old man's final words had been scratched into the soot on the anvil. "Keep the heat steady, the rest will take care of itself." Levi never forgot. For years he worked alone. He didn't talk much, but the forge didn't mind. It liked quiet company. The rhythm of his days stayed simple: heat, shape, cool, repeat. And though folks from the outside still came now and then looking to buy a blade or a story, he never turned any of them away. He didn't charge by gold or weight, he charged by purpose. "Tell me what you're fighting for," he'd say, "then we'll see if you've earned it."
Some came with greed in their eyes, and the forge went cold. Others came with need, and the coals sang back. Levi learned to tell the difference without words. In time, he became more than a smith. He became a kind of keeper, not of money or relics, but of balance. The world outside was rushing faster than any wagon could roll, and yet every so often someone would find their way to that quiet hill just to breathe again. They thought strange things now: metal from machines, shards of glass and wire, broken art of progress that no longer served.
Levi melted it and say, "Doesn't matter what it was," he'd tell them. "Matters what it's ready to become." One evening, a woman came reading in on a battered electric bike, the kind that hummed more than rumbled. She was young, city-born by the look of her clothes, but her eyes were old. She'd heard the legends, she said. Heard that the forge could make meaning out of nothing. Levi smiled, not unkindly. "The forge don't make nothing you don't already carry." She unstrapped her pack and laid out a mess of melted coins, crushed gadgets, and rusted steel. "This all I've got left," she whispered. "My company burned down. My name worthless. Thought maybe I'd start over." Levi nodded toward the coals. "Then let's see what you've still got that won't melt." They worked side by side for 3 nights. He taught her to swing slow, to breathe with the rhythm, to wait till the fire spoke first. On the 4th morning, when the sun hit the doorway, they pulled from the anvil a small pendant shaped like a flame. She held it in her hands like it was alive. "What it worth?" she asked. When she left, she didn't take her bike. Walked instead down the long road toward the horizon, pendant glinting in the dawn. From then on, word spread faster than it had before. Not by letters or stories this time, but through the strange new ether of wires and screens. People all the place the eternal forge now said it was weird the world still remembered how to slow down. Levi didn't much care what they did. All he cared about was keeping the rhythm steady, the coals honest. In his later years, the valley itself began to shift again. More travelers stayed. Some built small homes near the creek. Others brought seeds, tools, and books. Before long, Holler Rest had turned from a forgotten town into something like a refuge for the restless, a place where folks could trade noise for silence and speed for sweat. Levi never claimed to lead them. He just kept the fire going. But as the seasons passed, he started to notice something. The forge was changing. The heat was different, softer, maybe wiser. Some nights when the embers burned blue, he could swear he heard laughter in the crackle-etta coal, even old Warren like ghosts keeping him company. And then one night he dreamed of the forge as a living theme, not a place, but a presence. In his dream, the coals whispered, "You carried the fire long enough, Levi. It's time to pass it on." When he woke, his hands were steady, his heart calm. He knew what had to be done. That morning, he took his hammer, set it on the Edvil, and wrote a single note in the ledger. The flame don't die when the keeper rests. It moves to the next set of hands. Then he packed a sachet with his smallest tools, closed the forge door, and walked into the valley mist. He wasn't leaving, he was listening. By sundown, the townsfolk found the forge door open, coals still warm, and in their glow sat a young girl barefoot, salt on her cheeks, holding the hammer like it belonged there. When they asked her where she came from, she just smiled. "Didn't come from nowhere," she said. "Just heard the fire call." And just like that, the rhythm began dead. Her sleep, because the forge never belonged to a man. It belonged to time itself, to every hand willing to build, to every heart willing to believe that work done with love outlives its maker. And as you stand close enough on a still night, you can still hear it, the soft hum of heat and hope drifting out through the open door, the song of wealth made honest, the song of the fire that never ends. The girl named was Clara Wynn. She was no older than 15 that spring when the forge first taught her, but her eyes carried the same old soul stillness that marked every true keeper of that fire. She hadn't been raised in Holler Rest, truth be told. She'd wandered into the valley one night when the rain had turned the sky to ash and thunder rolled like cattle across the heavens. She'd followed the smell of smoke and iron, drawn by something she couldn't name. When the townsfolk found her sitting before the coals that still pulsed from Levi's last work, they didn't question much. Folks in Holler Rest had long since learned not to ask too many questions when the fire chose somebody. They watched quiet stones while Clara reached her small hands toward the glow and whispered, "I know you." And somehow, everyone believed her. The days that followed were slow and strange. The forge had stood empty near 2 weeks before she came, yet it felt alive again, brighter, warmer, more awake. Clara slept by the Abel, used rainwater for coffee, and worked without a teacher. But if you listened from the road, you'd swear you heard whispers in there like 100 voices murmuring advice through the sparks. She didn't forge horseshoes or knives like the old days. No, her hands built things no one had seen before. Tools shaped that questioned, hooks that caught sunlight, keys that fit no lock. She said she was learning the new language of metal, one that spoke to both the old world and the new. Word spread fast. First came the wanderers again, then the merchants, then the lost. Not the kind who'd misplaced a road, but the kind who'd misplaced themselves. The world outside was drowning in speed, and folks longed for something real again, something warm. Clara gave them that. One man dressed in the gleam of city silk arrived with nothing but a small box filled with broken circuits. He claimed he'd once owned a company that made machines smarter than people, but it had swallowed him whole. He asked Clara if she could make something from the ruin. She took his box, peered inside, and said, "You already did." Then she melted the metal down and recast it into a single copper bell. When it cooled, she placed it in his hand. "What this?" he asked, confused. "A reminder," she said, "to stop when you hear yourself ring." He left it hanging in his office. Some say that bell saved him a dozen times over. Another visitor, a young woman with calloused fingers and tired eyes, came seeking forgiveness for debts that couldn't be counted in coin. Clara listened without judgment, then knocked a handful of sand from the creek bed and poured it into the forge. Before she placed it in his hand. "What this?" he asked, confused. "A reminder," she said, "to stop when you hear yourself ring." He left it hanging in his office. Some say that bell saved him a dozen times over. Another visitor, a young woman with calloused fingers and tired eyes, came seeking forgiveness for debts that couldn't be counted in coin. Clara listened without judgment, then knocked a handful of sand from the creek bed and poured it into the forge. When the flames settled, there sat a small hourglass, no bigger than her palm. "It won't keep time," Clara said, handing it to her, "but it'll remind you to give it little by little." The forge became something greater than any town had seen. It became a crossroad for souls. But even then, Clara stayed humble. She never claimed to be more than a listener. "I don't make," she'd tell him. "I remember what the fire already knows." By her 20s, she'd built something few could have imagined. A small cool beside the forge, not for blacksmiths, but for makers of any kind. Artists, builders, thinkers, dreamers. She called it the Ember Hall. The rule was simple. No one paid with money. They paid with stories. Each student had to share the story of the first thing they built, broke, or lost. Then they'd write that story down and toss the paper into the forge. The smoke carried those words upward, feeding the flames like kindling of the soul. And somehow, through it, the valley thrived. Holler Rest had turned into a place, but progress and peace walked hand in hand.
Folks had power again, electrica made from the creek run, windmills turning on the ridge, but no one forgot the lesson of the forge, that every spark of creation came with a cost, and that cost was patience. Clara aged slower than most, or maybe it just seemed that way 'cause her spirit burned too steady to dim. She'd sit out on the porch in the evenings, rain tapping the tin roof, her voice low and rasped from years of smoke, telling stories to the young'uns. She'd talk about the first hammer, the ledger that still sat open on the shelf, the words of Etta Crane, Warren Pike, and Levi, their lessons carried like wind through generations. Sometimes she'd pause mid-story, smile faintly, and whisper, "They're still ill, you know, every one of them." The kids would ask where. She'd nod toward the fire, saying, "Right there, in the heat, in the work." Then they'd tap her chest, and as time went on, the world began to change yet again. Machines learned to think, cities reached for the sky, and money grew colder than iron it could. But even then, people still found their way to Holler Rest.
No matter how far the future stretched, there was always a need for a warm place to remember what mattered. Clara died in her sleep one summer night. Quiet ta'd rain. They found her with her hand resting on the anvil and a small smile on her face. The forge still burned steady, gold, alive. In her journal, she'd left one final note. The world don't need more makers, it needs more rememberers. Keep the heat honest. When the townsfolk begged for her farewell, no one cried. The air was too full of warmth for sorrow. They lit a single spark from the forge and carried it to the creek, letting it float downstream in a small lantern. It drifted away, glowing like a star fallen into water. And when it disappeared round the bend, a new sound rose in the distance, the etch of hammers, faint but sure. Someone new had already lit another fire. And so the rhythm continued, just as it always had and always would. The forge, the flame, the faith and work done true, it all went on, changing hands but never losing heart. Even now, on quiet nights when the rain whispers soft against tin, you can almost hear the murmur of that eternal forge mind in any soul who listens, that wealth ain't counted in gold or grain, it in patience, it in purpose, and it in the sound of a hammer falling steady against the heartbeat of the earth. Long after Clara Light faded from the valley, the forge stood quiet, not dead, but sleeping, like an old hound by the hearth. Years passed in the kind of silence that old time itself can hum, and Holler Rest began to grow vines around its memory. New generations came, born into a world that no longer remembered what sweat smelled like when it met steel. The city lights had reached even the edges of the valley now, stretching their electric veins across the hills. Still, the forge waited. It waited through droughts, through winters mean enough to split bone, through floods that washed the road clean of its history. Folks passed by it like they would at Old Oak, niced it, maybe nodded, but never stopped. The stories had faded to whispers, and the whispers to echoes, until one autumn evening, when a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled through the hollow, snapping branches and stirring up dust. And in that chaos came a wanderer, a man wrapped in a heavy duster, his boots caked with the mud of 100 miles. He was a stranger to most, but not to the forge. His name was Silas Boone, a drifter by accounts. Some said he'd been a trader, others claimed he'd worked the mines in New Austin, but none knew for sure. He carried a notebook bound in worn leather and a harmonica that hadn't sung in years. He found the forge by accident, or so he thought. The door creaked open, spilling the smell of iron and dust. The coals were cold, yet somehow the air still held the warmth of a memory. Silas stepped inside, brushed the rain from his hat, and stood before the Evel like a man standing at a gate. There on the wall hung a plaque, tarnished with age. The words carved into it were simple: keep the heat honest. He ran his fingers over the letters, muttering, "Honest, huh? Guess we'll see about that whole statement." He struck a match, lit the old oil lamp on the bench, and found Clara's journal sitting where she'd left it. He opened to the last page, read the line about rememberers, and smiled faintly. "Guess I'm late to class, Miss Wynne." Silas wasn't a blacksmith. He wasn't much of anything anymore, but something about that place, its hush, its weight, its history, spoke to the part of him that hadn't quit yet. He unpacked his few tools, found a hammer with the initials LP carved into its handle, and set to work cleaning the forge. Day by day, he rebuilt what time had tried to bury, fixed the bellows, cleared the chimney, oiled the hinges, and when he finally lit the coals again, he didn't know what he was doing, didn't know how to temper steel or shape blade. He just knew he needed to hear that sound, the steady beat of work. At first, it was chaos. He burned his fingers, cracked a dozen tongs, and cursed loud enough to scare the crows off the ridge. But the forge didn't mind. It just watched, patient they'd always, and slowly Silas began to learn the rhythm.
Yes, we'll see about that, Holford.
Struck a match, lit the old oil lamp on the bench, and found Clara's journal sitting where she'd left it. He opened to the last page, read the line about rememberers, and smiled faintly. "Guess I'm late to class, Miss Wynn." Silas wasn't a blacksmith. He wasn't much of anything anymore, but something about that place, its hush, its weight, its history, spoke to the part of him that hadn't quit yet. He unpacked his few tools, found a hammer with the initials LP carved into its handle, and set to work cleaning the forge. Day by day, he rebuilt what time had tried to bury, fixed the bellows, cleared the chimney, oiled the hinges, and when he finally lit the coals again, he didn't know what he was doing, didn't know how to temper steel or shape blade. He just knew he needed to hear that sound, the steady beat of work. At first, it was chaos. He burned his fingers, cracked a dozen tongs, and cursed loud enough to scare the crows off the ridge. But the forge didn't mind. It just watched, patient they'd always, and slowly Silas began to learn the rhythm. One night, when the moon hung low and the world out had gone quiet, he found himself humming a tune low, drawling the kind of melody made for empty roads. The hammer rose and fell in time with it. Sparks danced to the beat, and when he stopped, breathing heavy, there on the givel lay something he hadn't meant to make, a small horseshoe, rough but true. He stared at it for a long while, then laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Guess the fire still knows what it's doing." Word of the forge glow spread again. It always did. Folks from the nearby towns came riding, inquiry at first, then reverent. Silas never taught himself the keeper. He said he was just watching over it till the next hand showed up. But he did something new, something none before him had dared. He started recording stories. Every traveler, every wanderer, every lost soul who came through the forge had to tell a story before they left. Silas would listen close, then write it down in that leather notebook. He called it the Ledger of Hand.
It ain't no use making things that no one remembers who swung the hammer. Just stories piled up, miners who'd lost their homes, farmers who'd bet the rain wrong, lovers who'd run from the noise of the cities, all finding peace for a spell by that old anvil. And every night Silas would sit outside the forge, harmonica in end, playing tunes soft the heartbeat while the smoke curled up into the stars. But even legends grow tired. One bitter winter when the snows came early and the river froze solid, Silas fell sick. He kept working till his breath came out in clouds and his cough echoed off the walls. The townsfolk begged him to rest, but he'd just smile and say, "Fire don't go cold for one man comfort." When spring came, they found him sitting by the forge, head bowed, hat tipped forward, notebook open to a fresh page. His last words were scrawled in shaky ink. "You're reading this, you've got work to do."
The fire don't care who tends it. It asks that you do. They buried him on the hill beside Warren, Levi, and Clara under a simple stone rocked with a hammer and flame. The forge didn't go quiet. Days later, a rider came from the east. A young woman with sot already on her hands, looking for the place she'd dreamed of since childhood. She found it still burning, the coals red at sunrise, the ledger waiting on the bench. She read Silas' note, smiled through tears, and whispered, "All right, old man, I'll keep it honest." The hammer sang again that night. And always the forge listened, breathing slow, eternal, alive with the heat of every hand that had trusted its glow. Because the truth, the one lesson that time had written clearer than any other, was simple. You don't own the fire, you borrow it. You feed it what real. And when your turn done, you leave it burning for the next soul brave enough to believe in its light. Years rolled onward at the slow bend of a river, and the story of that old forge drifted beyond holler rest once more.
The fire don't care who tends it. It asks that you do. They buried him on the hill beside Warren, Levi, and Clara, under a simple stone rocked with a hammer and flame. The forge didn't go quiet. Days later, a rider came from the east, a young woman with sot already on her hands, looking for the place she'd dreamed of since childhood. She found it still burning, the coals red sunrise, the ledger waiting on the bench. She read Silas' note, smiled through tears, and whispered, "All right, old man, I'll keep it honest." The hammer sang again that night. And always the forge listened, breathing slow, eternal alive with the heat of every hand that had trusted its glow. Because the truth, the one lesson that time had written clearer than any other, was simple. You don't own the fire, you borrow it, you feed it what real. And when your turn done, you leave it burning for the next soul brave enough to believe in its light. Years rolled onward at the slow bend of a river, and the story of that old forge drifted beyond holler rest once more.
This time it didn't travel by hoof or by word of mouth, it traveled by light. Someone from the city had wandered through one summer, a journalist or filmmaker, maybe with a fancy camera and a voice full of disbelief. She'd meant to stay a day or two just to write the human interest piece about the ancient smithy still glowing in a digital age. But when she sat before the coals, she forgot all about her deadlines. That night she filmed the fire up close, each spark like a heartbeat, each swing of the hammer like a prayer. The video found its way onto the world's screens within a week, and the world couldn't stop watching. In a time when people lived through glass and sound waves, when everything was instant and weighty, that slow rhythm of iron and breath struck deep. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some said it made them cry. Others said it made them remember their fathers, their mothers, their grandfathers, the smell of oil, the hum of work, the dignity of something made by hand. The girl who'd taken up Silas Boone's place didn't expect any of it. Her name was June Mercer, a blacksmith apprentice from a ghost town 2 VAs over. She'd come seeking quiet, not fame. But now, everyday travelers came from far-off places just to sit by her fire. At first, June resisted. "There ain't no show," she told the first reporter who showed up with a mic. It a conversation, but soon she saw what was real happening. These weren't tourists. They were pilgrims of a kind. Not after spectacle, but after meaning. So she changed her rule. "Anyone can come," she said, "but you can't take pictures, Tiv, after you've listened." The forge wasn't about iron anymore. It was about memory, about slowness, about wealth that couldn't fit in a vault. June made trinkets, yes rings, knives, pendants. But the real craft was what she helped people forgive themselves for. She'd listen to their stories like the others before her, silently, eyes on the flame. And when they were done, she'd hand them something forged from the leftover scrap, a gear from a tractor that failed, a pipe from a city sewer, a nail from a forgotten barn. "There'd always, she'd say, there's no such thing as useless metal, only metal waiting to remember." Before long, people began to send her shipments boxes of broken things from all corners of the earth. Airplane screws, melted cell phones, dented wedding rings, even old coins from nations long gone. She never asked for them, but she melted each one down with reverence, pouring the mix into molds shaped by instinct, not design. Some she sold, but most she gave away. To children, to drifters, to the tired and the brave. The money came anyway. Donnan, sponsors, investors, all wanting to turn the Eternal Forge into a brand. June refused every one of them. "Be like for buying or selling," she told a well-dressed man who came from a tech company one autumn, his smile slick and glass. "This place belongs to the fire, and the fire don't sign contracts," he'd laugh. "You could make millions with this side of story," she'd smile back, soft but sharp. "Stories already made me rich." After that, she nailed a small brass plate to the forge door. The inscription read, "The richest thing a soul can do is work with its hands." That phrase became a movement. Folks began posting it everywhere on videos, photos, t-shirts, websites. It spread like wild clover, and soon a quiet rebellion was brewing. People started building again. In garages, in basements, in fields under tarps. They forged knives, stitched leather, carved wood, repaired old radios. Some called it nostalgia, others called it therapy, but those who truly understood just called it returning home. And always somewhere in that hum of rediscovery, June Forge burned like a heartbeat in the distance. Years passed and she grew older, her hair silvering in the smoke. The visitors slowed, the trend faded, like all things must, but that never bothered her. The ones who kept them in were the ones who needed it. One night a boy, maybe 12, maybe 13, wandered in carrying a small backpack and eyes full of storm. He said he'd seen one of her old videos online, that his father had left, that his mother was working 2 jobs, that he didn't know what to do with the ache that lived in him. June didn't speak for a long while. She just tended the fire. Then he handed him a small bar of iron and said, "Hit it." He did. Once, twice, then. By the 10th strike, tears were falling with the sweat. She didn't stop him. Didn't need to. The fire did the rest. When he was done, there on the Idville lay nothing fancy, just a bent bar. But June picked it up and smiled. "You see that curve?" she asked. He nodded, breathing heavy. "That's what happens when something breaks honest. You can bend back from that."
He came back every summer after that. By the time he turned 18, he was teaching other kids to swing the hammer. June watched from her porch a new fire started sprouting across the valley, small forges, each one humming with its own kind of song. She didn't feel possessive, she felt grateful. The fire had found new voices. When June finally passed, the townsfolk didn't hold a funeral. They held a forging. Every smith in the valley, young and old, brought a piece of metal, melted it to death, and poured it into a single mold. A great circular ring big enough for 2 men to stand inside. They set it at the entrance of Hollow Rest. It gleamed like sunrise, and etched across the top were the words she'd lived by. You can't buy time, but you can shape what it gives you. Now travelers still come, though fewer each year. They stop before that ring, touch the metal, and listen. If the wind right, they swear they can still hear the hum of June hammer, faint but steady, whispering through the hills. Not a legend, not a myth, just the truth, burning the way it always has, quiet, stubborn, eternal. The fire still remembers. And as long as someone listens, it'll never forget. Years later, long after June Forge had turned to memory and her anvil grown moss along the edges, the valley changed again. It wasn't the kind of change a man could see at first glance. It was slower, quieter, like a mountain shifting under snow. The old town had faded to fewer than 50 souls, most of them too old to care about much besides their garden coffee. But somewhere deep in those hills, where the world noise still hadn't quite reached, a new kind of traveler found the road to Hollow Rest. This traveler wasn't looking for gold, nor for rest, nor for stories. He was looking for truth. Name was Elias Cross, a finance man once, though he didn't call himself that anymore. He'd built a company so big that his face had been printed in magazines. Folks said he could move markets with a whisper, but one day when his money finally stopped meaning anything, he'd packed a bag and disappeared, left behind the skyscrapers, the meetings, the boardrooms that smelled of fear and coffee, and just started walking. He'd heard the story of the Eternal Forge by accident, an old clip from June Day's Schuler Fitzfringing on the net. The video wasn't fancy, yet her standing there by the fire saying the richest thing a soul can do is work with its hands. Those words haunted him. By the time he found Hollow Rest, Elias looked more like a preacher gone weary than a banker. His shoes were dusted yet, his eyes darker still. He stood before the ring at the entrance, the one the townsfolk had made from melted memories, and just stared. After a long while, he stepped through it. The forge was quiet, but not dead. Someone had been keeping it alive in small ways. A swept floor, a clean bench, a bucket half full of rainwater. The Evil sat that it always had, patient and proud. Elias ran his fingers along the steel, and the weight of it near rat him to his knees. He whispered, "You been waiting long?" Then he lit the coals. He didn't know what he was doing, but he didn't need to. He wasn't there to build or sell. He was there to remember. At first, he worked in silence. His hands shook, his arms ached, his thoughts ran wild. He struck metal the way a man strikes down ghosts. Each hammer blow echoed like confession. For weeks, no one came near the old forge except the wind and the crows, but when the sound finally reached town, the folks smiled. Another keeper, they said. Elias didn't try to be one. He didn't even stay in the house. He slept beside the forge, reading old journals, Clara, Silas, June soaking up their words like scripture. He found the ledger, too, still thick with names and stories. Near the back, he noted the empty space left unfilled. The paper was yellowed, but the edges still soft, like it had been waiting. So one night he wrote Elias Cross, who came to melt the weight of his own fortune and learn what wealth really means. He closed the book, wiped his hands, and smiled for the first time in years. Before long, others found their way back again, not through fame, not through news, but through whisper. A college kid from the city who'd grown sick of code and screens. A carpenter whose hands had gone stiff with arthritis but still longed to make. A teacher who'd lost her job and come looking for something to believe in. Elias didn't teach. He just showed. He taught them how to hold the hammer like they were holding time itself, how to listen for the rhythm in the metal, how to keep the fire fed not with coal but with attention. The world don't burn out, he'd tell them, we forget how to feed it slow. As the seasons passed, Hollow Rest came alive again, not with noise or commerce, but with craft. A handful of forges flickered to life, powered by solar panels and steam turbines, but run by hands that understood the old way. They dated the Ember Revival. It wasn't a movement, it was a memory come back to work. People began trading again, not in dollars, but in hours worked for lessons, goods for time. The valley started humming like a living thing, and at the center of it, Elias stood at the forge, older now, calmer, speaking softer than the fire itself.
He forged coins, not to spend but to give, small brass tokens with the words, "Keep the heat honest," stamped into each one. He'd hand them to those who'd learned, those who'd built, those who'd given something true. One day, a young man from the city arrived with a camera, same age that girl long ago. He wanted to make a documentary. Elias agreed, but only under one condition. No talk of money, he said. Only talk of work. The film came out months later. It was quiet, simple, just an old man teaching others to forge, talking about patience and truth. But somehow, it caught fire across the world. Not because of spectacle, but because of stillness. People began to remember again. Corcoran tried to sponsor the forge. Banks wanted to fund a heritage craft initiative. Elias refused every F. "You can't scale what's sacred," he'd say. Years later, when he grew too weak to swing the hammer, he left a final note in the ledger. His handwriting was steady, every word carved into the page like truth itself. The first fire taught men to see in the dark. The last one will teach us to listen. When they found him, he was sitting by the forge, eyes closed, palms open toward the coals. The fire was still burning. It always was. The townsfolk didn't bury him under a stone. They cast a bell, one forged from scraps of every generation that came before. Warren tools, Clara hourglass, Silas hammer, June ring, and Elias brass coin. When it was done, they hung it above the forge. It wasn't meant to toll. It was meant to ring only when the fire was honest. And if you will find yourself in hollow rest on a stormy night, when the rain runs down the hills and thunder hums like memory, you might just hear it. A Z low chime drifting through the dark, telling the world that someone somewhere still remembers what it means to build slow, love true, and keep the fire honest. Decades passed, and the story of Hollow Rest slipped once more into the long folds of time. The modern world moved on, chasing the next flash, the next scheme, the next digital gold rush. But every few years, when the noise grew too loud and the cities too bright, someone somewhere would whisper about that valley where the fire never died. They'd say it wasn't on any map, that you couldn't find it by looking. You had to feel your way there. Those who came didn't always stay, but they never left the same. The world had made them hollow in ways money couldn't fill. They were the dreamers turned doubters, the winners who'd forgotten what winning meant. And each one found something in that valley, an S, a lesson, a rhythm that put their hearts back in tune. One of them was Nora Vale, a writer from a city that never slept. She'd made a fortune selling words that didn't belong to her ads, headlines, slogans for things she didn't believe in. But her mind had gone quiet, her pen dry. She'd seen the clip of Elias Cross years after his death, that same soft voice saying, "The world don't burn out. We just forget how to feed it slow." So she packed a single bag and went looking for the place he spoke from. It took her 3 weeks to find it, 3 weeks of wrong turns, half-collapsed bridges, and country roads that led to silence. When she arrived, the forge was still standing. Weathered, sure, but alive. The bell hung above the door, dark and still, as if waiting to judge her worth. She stepped inside and felt the world narrow to breath and ash. The air was heavy, thick with memory. She touched the anvil and felt warmth, real warmth, like someone had been there. "Guess I'm late," she whispered. But she wasn't. Behind her came a shuffle of boots and the scent of smoke. Out from the shadows stepped a tall man with soot-streaked cheeks and eyes kind of dusk. He introduced himself as Micah, the newest keeper. Said he'd been there near 20 years. Fire's still honest, he told her, but it don't tend itself. Nora stayed. Not long at first, just a few days, but something in her began to quiet. The kind of quiet that don't come from running away, but from finally stopping. She watched Micah work, the hammer rising and falling in slow conversation with the world. Every strike had a meaning, every breath had weight. One night, when the rain was coming down soft and steady, she asked him why he stayed. Micah smiled. "City folks talk about compounding interest. Out here, we talk about compounding truth. Every generation leaves a little more in the coals than they took out." That line stuck with her. "Like you lost a little water, and I'll write you, I'll write again." But she wasn't. Behind her came a shuffle of boots and the scent of smoke. Out from the shadows stepped a tall man with soot-streaked cheeks and eyes kind of dusk. He introduced himself as Micah, the newest keeper. Said he'd been there near 20 years. Fire's still honest, he told her, but it don't tend itself. Nora stayed. Not long at first, just a few days, but something in her began to quiet. The kind of quiet that don't come from running away, but from finally stopping. She watched Micah work, the hammer rising and falling in slow conversation with the world. Every strike had a meaning. Every breath had weight. One night, when the rain was coming down soft and steady, she asked him why he stayed. Micah smiled. City folks talk about compounding interest. Out here, we talk about compounding truth. Every generation leaves a little more in the coals than they took out. That line stuck with her. She wrote down in her notebook the first sentence she'd written in years. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. She learned to forge, and not perfectly, but patient. She made nails, then hinges, then a single key she couldn't explain the use for. And when she wasn't working, she wrote in the ledger, collecting stories from whoever wandered through. There was a man who'd built a company from dust and lost it in a storm of greed. A mother who'd sold her last heirloom to feed her child. A girl who'd left home, but she didn't know what dreams were hers anymore. Each one left lighter than they came. The valley began to hum again, not loud but steady. Fires burned in 3 forges now, each tended by someone who'd come to stay. They shared meals, traded stories, and spoke of the world not to something to fix, but to something to forgive. And through it all, that bell above the forge stayed still, silent, they watching, until one winter evening when Nora found herself alone. Micah had gone to tend the livestock, and the others were asleep. She sat by the anvil, turning that old brass key in her palm, wondering what she'd built it for. The fire was low, almost out. But she thought of something Silas Boone had once written in his ledger. You don't own the fire, you borrow it. She rose, added keenly, and struck the flint. The forge came alive again, the flames curling like spirits in the dark. She placed the key in the coals and whispered, "Show her what you're for." The metal glowed bright and gold. Just then, the bell above her gave one perfect ring. It echoed through the valley, soft, sorrowful, alive. By dawn, folks from the other forges had bed, asking what happened. Nora said she didn't know. Maybe the fire remembered something, she told them. From that day forward, the bell rang once a year. Never the same day, never the same hour, always when it was needed. Some said it marked a birth, others a death. Some believed it tolled for a new keeper, others for a heart turned honest again. Nora stayed until her hair turned white and her hands too shaky to hold the hammer. When she passed, they found the brass key hanging above the ledger. No one had figured out what it opened, but on the back of her final page she'd written, "The fire is patient. It don't rush the lesson. Wealth ain't what you earn, it's what you pass along still warm." White. Not the system under downward and genuine. It don't live to what you earn, it's what you pass along still warm. Another forge continued. Centuries might come and go, and the world might forget again, and always does. But every so often, men and women lose their way chasing numbers instead of meaning. They'll start to dream again of a valley where the rain never kills the flame, where wealth ain't measured in gold or graphs, but in the slow, humble rhythm of work done true. They'll wander till they find it, and when they do, they'll see a bell above a door, a forge glowing soft against the night, and a line etched in brass that waited through every age. Keep the heat honest, and in that glow they'll remember, for did a heartbeat, what it means to be rich. A generation later, the valley became myth. Holler Rest was no longer a place men could point to on a map. It was a story told in the quiet, between raindrops, a whisper traded between the weary. The old roads had crumbled, the forges turned to moss and memory, but the spirit of the flame, well, that thing never died. It all learned to hide where the world least expected it. Far to the east, in a city made of glass and lightning, a young woman named Marin Cole worked in a tower that reached past the clouds. She was part of a world that never slept, a world that traded time like a currency and called exhaustion a badge of honor. Her days were on numbers, her nights on noise. She managed portfolios, algorithms, trades that lived and died faster than a man could blink. And yet, every time her screen flickered and she saw the red of rising markets, her chest felt hollow. One night during another stretch of endless overtime, she fell asleep at her desk. When she woke, the monitors were off, but a faint glow lingered, a screen scan, maybe, or a dream. It was an image she didn't remember, setting an old forge, rain hissing on the coals, and a sim phrase written beneath, "Keep the heat honest." She stared at it for a long while. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She closed her laptop, turned off her phone, and stepped outside. The rain was coming down, soft, warm, like a hand on the shoulder. She walked until the city gave way to silence, until all she could hear was her own breath. The next morning, she quit her job. Her friends said she'd lost her mind. Her parents begged her to reconsider, but Marin wasn't running from something. She was running towards something. She started reading about old crafts, forgotten trades, places with men and women still worked with fire and wood and soil. She found mention of Holler rest in a tattered online archive, a story written by a traveled journalist nearly 100 years old. There were no directions, just tales of a forge that burned slower than time itself. That was enough. She sold her apartment, bought that old van, and drove west with a map drawn in guesswork. And every few days she'd stop at small towns, asking about the place. Most had never heard of it. A few old-timers shook their heads, saying it was just a legend. But one night, deep in the mountains, she pulled into a diner. Just as the rain started. There was an old man sitting alone at the counter, wearing a coat older than she was. When she mentioned Holler Rest, he didn't laugh, didn't even blink. He just pointed out the window toward the dark ridges beyond. Fire's still up there, he said. Always is if you're patient. So she went. The road wound through fog and gravel, past broken fences and forgotten homes. Her van finally gave out near dawn, so she walked the rest of the way. By the time the sun rose, she saw it, barely a small glow in the trees. The forge was there, still standing, the roof half collapsed, the bell above it green with age, but the coals, they were warm. She stood there for a long while, not speaking, not moving. Then she set down her bag, found an old hammer on the bench, and started to work. At first, her hands shook. She missed every strike. Her city-born skin blistered, but she didn't quit. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. She lived off the land, cleaned the forge, patched the roof. She read every name in the ledger: Clara, Silas, June, Elias, Nora, and wept that she knew them. They became her teachers, her company in the dark. Over time, word got out again. The internet, fickle it was, found her story through a photographer who stumbled upon her in the woods. The hit spread fast. A lone woman working by firelight, her face half lit, her eyes steady. They thought her the last keeper. People started coming, not as tourists, but as pilgrims, engineers, teachers, office workers, wanderers, all tired, all lost in the same way. They wanted to see if the fire was real. Marin welcomed them, same as those before her had. She didn't talk about wealth or success. She talked about return, about slow building, quiet earning, steady hearts. She showed them how to swing the hammer, how to listen to the iron, how to feed the coals without smothering them. When someone asked her why she stayed, she said because the world's still too fast. Someone got a hold of the slow years, rolled on, and Marin grew older. Her forge became less a place and more a message. People built small fires of their own backyard workshops. Kitchens turned studios. Offices turned sanctuaries of stillness. They shared her teachings across digital planes, but they always said the same thing. Don't watch the flame. Work with it. Before she passed, Marin wrote one last note in the ledger. The ink had faded on the pages before hers, but her words burned clear ere sunrise. I used to chase numbers. Now I count sparks. One day they'll add up to a dawn. They buried her in the valley, no stone, no ceremony. Just a piece of metal shaped like a heart, placed on the Edville. And when the next rain came, the bell rang once more. Somewhere out in the world, in a city too busy to breathe, a young man looked up from his glowing screen and felt something stir. He couldn't explain it, but that night he closed his laptop early, stepped outside, and watched the rain fall on his hands. Somewhere deep inside him, the coals woke up. The fire, patient deed, had found another keeper. And so it continues, not in one forge, not in one town, but wherever a soul decides that the truest kind of wealth is earned not in speed, but in stillness. Years bled into decades once more, and the world spun itself into a new kind of frenzy, digital, dazzling, and yet hollow at a dry creek bed. Machines whispered promises of effortless gain, wealth without labor, and progress without patience. But somewhere between those illusions, the quiet ember of Holler Rest kept glimmering, passed from voice to voice, from one weatherer's soul to another. By then, the story had splintered into 100 tellings. Some said it was a myth from the old frontier. Others swore it was a parable written by a forgotten monk. But every version held a common thread. The forge, the flame, and the words keep the heat honest. That phrase found its way into corners no one expected. A songwriter in Nashville turned it into a verse. A tired CEO quoted it in his farewell letter. A teacher wrote it on the blackboard every morning, telling her students it wasn't about fire, it was about faith. But the world doesn't hold on to quiet things easily. The noise gets loud again. The greedy grow restless, and the honest grow weary. Until one day, when all that digital gold started losing its shine, markets crashed harder than a stormed barn, banks folded, currencies burned in invisible flames. People who'd built their lives around zeros and ones found themselves staring at nothing. Power grids failed, networks fell silent, and the cities, they went dark for the first time in centuries. At that, when people remember the old stories, some haunted the blackout winter, others the great quiet. But out there in that hush, something sacred stirred. Folks who'd never swung a hammer before started seeking warmth then. They tore down billboards to make kindling, used old phones as paperweights, and looked each other in the eye like it meant something again. And among all that chaos, a rumor started spreading. It said the fire from Holler Rest had come back. Humanity, no one knew where the rumor began. Maybe from an old broadcast that flickered drew for a second before dying. Maybe from the dream of a child who'd never seen a forge. But people followed it like moths to an honest flame. They wandered for miles through snow and silence until they found it. Not a valley, not a town, but a circle of fire pits built by hundreds of hands. Each pit burned steady, surrounded by families, travelers, strangers. They called it the Ember Line. At the center of that camp, an old man stood with soot on his cheeks and a guitar slung over his shoulder. He wasn't rich nor holy, but he had a way of speaking that made silence lean in. He said his name was Cal Boone. Now, no one knew if he was kin to Silas Boone from the old legends, but he carried the same look, the kind that half wisdom, half weariness. He'd been a banker once, lost everything when the world turned dark, but instead of despairing, he walked. It said he followed a voice he couldn't explain, a whisper that kept saying the fire don't end, son. It's at wait. When he reached that barren plain where the Ember Line now stood, he found a rusted anvil half buried in the earth. It wasn't much, but he knelt beside it, cleared the dirt, and struck a sealed spark with a flint he'd carried since boyhood. That spark caught. And by the next night, there were 12 fires. By the next week, 100. Cal didn't build an fire, he built a circle. He told stories while the wind howled, stories of the old keepers, Clara, who taught time a craft, Silas, who forged silence into faith, June, who made a forge out of grief, Elias, who melted wealth into humility, Nora, who lent to the bell whisper in Marin, who kept the slow in a world too far. He said, they ain't legends, they're reminders. Every generation forget the flame run back wearing a new name and under that night sky, dotted with stars as their hammered silver, the people believed him. Children learned how to shape hooks and knives. Elders told stories instead of forecasts. That he defined. And why? It's a warming of that map. Trans a yili yusak on the mine new year as bank the champ. They me on them plain the Ember Line now stood. He found a rusted anvil half buried in the earth. It wasn't much, but he knelt beside it, cleared the dirt, and struck a sealed spark with a flint he'd carried since boyhood. That spark caught, and by the next night there were 12 fires. By the next week, 100. Cal didn't build an empire, he built a circle. He told stories while the wind howled, stories of the old keepers. Clara, who taught time a craft. Silas, who forged silence into faith, June, who made a forge out of grief, Elias, who melted wealth into humility, Nora, who lent to the bell whisper, Morin, who kept the slow in a world too far. He said, they ain't legends, they're reminders. Every generation forget the flame run back wearing a new name, and under that night sky, dotted with stars, they were hammered silver. The people believed him. Children learned how to shape hooks and knives. Elders told stories instead of forecasts. Neighbors traded warmth instead of currency. The fire spread. You or any man the same who was washed up in a creek near home. The tugger was charred, but one page survived. On it was written, the truth wealth is not a hoping thing, but it has power. Every ember taken from the circle carried the same rule carved into wood and passed by word. Feed it slow, share it true. Keep the heat honest. Years later, when the power grids came back and the world remembered how to hum again, the Ember Line faded into memory. But the fire, it didn't go out. It lived in workshops and kitchens and any hand that chose patience over profit. One day, a young girl named June Cross listened until Elias, though she didn't know it, found an old notebook washed up in a creek near her home. The cover was charred, but one page survived. On it was written, "The true wealth is not in holding flame, but in passing it on still warm." She showed it to her teacher, who showed it to his brother, who showed it to a newsman. Within a year, the phrase circled the world again, but this time it didn't fade. Because the world had learned that no algorithm could forge meaning, no market could mint patience, and no machine could imitate the slow heartbeat of human hands at work. And so, in small ways that never made headlines, the old ways returned. A blacksmith guild reopened in Colorado. A candle shop in Kyoto taught children the art of steady light. A cafe in Berlin printed every cup with the phrase, "Keep the heat honest." And when the first stars rose each evening in 1,000 cities across the world, a few souls would wood to the horizon, close their eyes and swear they could hear it, a faint, deep ring carrying through the air, the bell of hollow rest, still tolling for those who choose to build slow, burn steady, and live true. The forge never ended. It just moved inside the hearts of men, and as long as there one hand left to strike a spark, the fire will keep teaching us, quietly, patiently, how to be rich in the right way. Long after the ember line faded from sight, its lesson lingered like a low hum in the bones of the world. The civilization rebuilt itself, she-9 and smarter than then, but somewhere deep inside its humming heart, it carried a piece of that quiet. Machines got cleverer, towers grew taller, and wealth flowed faster than thought. But the folks who remembered, truly remembered, could still hear that distant ring of the bell whenever they stopped long enough to listen. One of those folks was a man named Rory Vance. He wasn't famous, weren't poor neither, just one of those faces you'd pass on a train, coffee in hand, eyes half awake. He built his life on efficiency, automated schedules, digital investments, smart everything. His world ran smoother than a greased hinge, but it also ran without a soul. One rainy evening, Rory sat in his office tower, staring at the skyline bay lightning flash behind the glass. His screens glowed with numbers climbing higher than he had thought he'd see. He should have felt proud, triumphant even. Instead, he felt hollow, as if each zero added another layer of silence around him. He leaned back, and his reflection looked older than it ought to. His hands trembling just a touch, like a tired engine misfruing. Then, right there between thunderclaps, the power cut out. Whole city blinked dark. At first, he cursed, but then, in that deep hush that followed, something strange happened. He heard dripping. Not the kind from leaky pipes, but the kind that fills a world gone quiet. A steady rhythm, soft and patient. Then came another sound, faint and sure, a heartbeat, a ring. Not the high-pitched kind from alarms or phones. This was lower, older, a single bell tone that carried warmth instead of warning. It faded, it quicked, it came, but Rory felt it settle in his chest like an ember taking root. He sat there for what felt like hours, the storm moving on, the world breathing slow again. When the lights flickered back to life, he didn't turn his screens on. He reached instead for a dusty old book sitting on the shelf, a gift from his grandfather, still wrapped in brown paper. He tore the paper away and opened it. Inside was a collection of old journal pages, faded names like Silas Boone and Nora Vale scribbled along the edges. In the back was a phrase underlined twice, "You don't own the fire, you borrow it." That night, Rory didn't sleep. Packed a bag, left a note on his desk, and by sunrise he was driving west. The road took him through forgotten highways and small towns barely hanging on. The rain followed him, soft and steady, like a hand guiding him somewhere. He didn't know where he was going, only that he was heading toward instead of away. Days later, he found himself in a valley he couldn't name. It wasn't rocked on any GPS, wasn't written on any map, but it felt right. The air there was thick with pine and memory. He saw a shack standing crooked against the mist, smoke rising gentle from its chimney. Inside, an old woman was sitting by a forge no bigger than a dinner table, humming a tune older than the hills. "You finally heard it, didn't you?" she said without looking up. Rory froze. "Heard what?" "The bell," she said, tap, tap, tapping, a hammer against iron. Ain't many still do. He told her his story about the storm, the silence, the ring. She listened, nodded, and finally smiled. "Then you're ready to learn. Sit yourself down. And he did. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The you-know-rage crime. See him or my gate. He packed a bag, left a note on his desk, and by sunrise he was driving west. The road took him through forgotten highways and small towns barely hanging on. The rain followed him, soft and steady, like a hand guiding him somewhere. He didn't know where he was going, only that he was heading toward instead of away. Days later, he found himself in a valley he couldn't name. It wasn't rocked on any GPS, wasn't written on any map, but it felt right. The air there was thick with pine and memory. He saw a shack standing crooked against the mist, smoke rising gentle from its chimney. Inside, an old woman was sitting by a forge no bigger than a dinner table, humming a tune older than the hills. "You finally heard it, didn't you?" she said without looking up. Rory froze. "Heard what?" "The bell," she said, "tap, tap, tapping a hammer against iron. Ain't many still do." He told her his story about the storm, the silence, the ring. She listened, nodded, and finally smiled. "Then you're ready to learn. Sit yourself down," and he did. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. She taught him how to build with his hands again, real building, not numbers or code. He learned how to strike the iron, how to listen for the right tone, how to breathe with the fire instead of over it. She told him stories at night about the old forges, about Marin, about Nora and Silas, about how the world forgets and remembers in cycles. Rory asked her once, "How do you know all this?" She smiled through the glow of the fire. "Because someone taught to, same I'm teaching you, that how the heat travels, not through fame, not through fortune, but through hands." By the time spring came, the forge was his to tend. The old woman packed her things, left a note by the Evel that read, "When the bell calls again, you'll know what to do." She disappeared before dawn, and so Rory stayed. He made tools for travelers, fixed hinges for farmers, even helped a young couple build a stove for their cabin down the ridge. Folks came by, drawn not by signs or adverts, but by word of warmth. He never charged more than he needed, never sold more than he could make. One evening, a little girl came by, clutching a broken pocket watch. Said it belonged to her granddaughter. He took it apart, piece by piece, and found it still ticking, just gummed up from years of neglect. He fixed it right there, handed it back, and told her, sometimes all it takes is patience. That night, when the stars were bright and the wind was still, Rory stepped outside. The world was quiet again. Then, from deep within the valley, that old bell rang once more. He smiled, whispering, "Guess it time again." He packed his tools the next morning and left the forge behind, walking toward the mountains. Some say he built another forge near the coast. Others claim he became a teacher, wandering from town to town. But wherever he went, he carried that phrase with him, scrawled on the inside of his hammer case. Keep the heat honest. And in the years that followed, the phrase made its way through the world again, not lead, scripture, or slogan, but through a quiet promise between those who refused to forget what the world had once been. Before speed, before noise, before men mistook wealth for worth, the fire lived on, not because it burned the brightest, but as someone always stayed behind to tend it slow. As the years passed, Rory's name faded into the dust, same made all the others before him. The forge he left behind turned to ruin again. But that wasn't failure, that was the way of things. The fire was never meant to stay put. It moved with the ones who needed it most, traveling from hand to hand at a whisper carried by wind, and it found its way, sure enough, to a boy named Wyatt Cole. Wyatt was born into a world that had rebuilt itself too well. Everything glowed, everything hummed. Folks could buy comfort in a click and trade dreams for data. But deep down, a hollowness had started to grow, a hunger for something that couldn't be downloaded. He worked at a warehouse by the city edge, the kind that never slept. The machines did most of the labor, so humans were there mostly to make sure the lights stayed green. It was a quiet sort of misery, the kind that doesn't shout, but eats at you slow. Every evening, Wyatt would sit on the loading dock, staring out past the smog at the faraway hills. He didn't know what called to him out there, but it tugged at him, licked gravity with the memory. One night, while sweeping up near the supply crates, he found an old metal box wedged behind a busted fan. Inside was a piece of blackened iron, curved like a bell fragment, wrapped in a cloth so old it crumbled at his touch. The cloth had words stitched in faded red thread. Feed it slow, share it true. He didn't know why, but the sight of it near bit his breath away. He felt a warmth crawl through his chest, not burning, just steady, sure, alive. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing that line over and over until finally he packed a bag and left before sunrise. He didn't leave a note, didn't even know where he was going. just started walking west. He traveled through plains and ghost towns, asking after the bell, the forge, the ember line. Anyone who'd heard of him, most laughed him off, called it folk nonsense. But one woman at a roadside diner gave him a look that lingered too long out past Ridgeway Creek, she said. They're a house with no roof, but a fire that don't quit. You find that, you'll find what you're looking for. He thanked her, left what little money he had, and kept going. Days later, he reached Ridgeway. It was barely more than a handful of barns and fences, but sure enough, at the far edge of town there stood a small stone shack. No roof, no door, just walls half-eaten by time. But inside, there was light, a faint orange flicker, small but alive. Wyatt stepped inside and knelt beside it. The coals were breathing just barely. He could feel the heat lick his palms, soft and pulsing. And for reasons he couldn't name, he whispered, "You waited on it, didn't you?" He found old tools buried under the rubble and bill, a hammer and a ledger so faded it looked like ghost skin. He started cleaning, building, working. Didn't know what he was doing, but every swing of the hammer felt right. Over the weeks, he bed wood, patched walls, learned to shape nails, pots, blades, whatever the town folks needed. They started coming around, curious first, then grateful. He charged little, asked for less. Said he wasn't here to sell, he was here to keep. When people asked what that meant, he'd just smile and say, "You'll know when you sit by the fire long enough." Before long, his forge became a gathering place. Folks who'd forgotten how to talk without rushing came just to listen to the steady ring of iron. Kids watched him work, learning the rhythm of patience. Travelers passed through, left something behind, stories, songs, tokens, and tug embers wrapped in clay bowls. Wyatt started kindling them carry fires. He told each visitor the same thing: don't hoard it, pass it when you see someone lost. Years later, those carry fires became a quiet symbol, one small clay bowl with the ember nestled inside. You'd find them in the strangest places, on city balconies, in train stations, at hospital windows. Folks said if you found one, it meant someone believed you still had warmth left to share. Wyatt never sought recognition, but one autumn night, an old journalist made her way to Ridgeway and sat by his forge. She asked to hear his story, and he told it plain. Told her about the box, the bell fragment, the road, and the coals that waited. When she asked him why he kept the fire alive, he stared at the flame and said softly, "Because every man needs something that don't vanish when the lights go out." That quote found its way across the world. Not in headlines, but whispered between people who were tired of hurrying for nothing. Corcoran tried to turn it into a slogan. They printed it on mugs and billboards, but folks could tell the difference between truth and myth. The real message stayed with the wanderers, the makers, the ones who worked by hand and heart. Wyatt grew old in that forge. His beard silvered, his hands calloused into stone. On his last avenue, a young boy sat by his side, the same age Wyatt had been when he found that bell fragment. The boy asked him, "What do I do when it's my turn?" Wyatt smiled slow, eyes reflecting the flame. "Don't make the fire yours, son. Just make sure it don't die on your watch." When dawn came, the forge burned steady, but Wyatt was gone. The boy picked up the hammer, the ledger, and the bell fragment. He didn't know the full story yet, but he knew enough to begin. And then the years rolled on, the legend changed names e'en. The world dulled it the way of the honest heat. But among the few who still lived by campfires on quiet nights, they that caught it what it always was, the keeping. The sound of that old bell still echoes through rainstorms, they say. Not loud, never loud, just steady. And if you listen close, when the fire crackles low and the night turns still, you might hear it too. The years that followed turned the keeping from a story into a quiet way of living. There wasn't a movement or a business, hell. Most folks didn't even know they were part of it. It was as if people remembering what mattered when everything else failed. The world had gotten fancy again, fast and sharp, like a knife that forgot what it was for. But here and there, in small pockets of stillness, the old lessons breathed. In the far north, a mechanic named Clara Dude built heaters for the towns that couldn't afford the big city grids. She didn't patent M or sell M for profit. She made M sturdy and simple, left M in town halls with a little plate that read, "Feed it slow, share it true." When someone asked her what it meant, she just grinned and said, "You wouldn't ask if you'd sat by the right kind of fire." And if you're in the desert,
A wanderer, Virgil's Creed, roamed from outpost to outpost with a cart full of scrap and a hammer strapped to his pack. He'd build windmills for water, fix broken stoves, mend fences, all for the price of a story. When people thanked him, he'd say, "Don't thank me. Thank the flame that waits in all of us." Even the cities, loud and glittering that they were, started to change. You'd find small rooftop gardens. Late office workers met after hours to grow tomatoes instead of portfolios. You'd see old neon signs repainted with simple words: patience pays, warmth wins. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't nostalgia, it was remembrance. And it spread the way good things always do, slow, steady, unseen, until it was everywhere. One man, a historian named Levi Crane, decided to trace the roots of this quiet fire. He wasn't no preacher or philosopher, but a curious soul trying to make sense of how so many people spoke the same strange phrases about forges, bells, embers. He dug through archives, recordings, half-burnt journals. He followed stories across continents through digital remnants and oral histories. What he found startled him.
Every century, every collapse, every new age had a version of it. A forge in one century, a bell in another, a code phrase in the next. It changed form but not feel. In one file, he found an old transcript from an interview with a man named Cal Boone. The words were grainy, barely audible, but clear enough to make out the line. "The fire don't end, son. It waits." Levi closed his laptop and sat still for a long while, the weight of those words settling in his chest like an anchor. He knew he had something bigger than a paper. He had proof of a lineage of honest builders, a thread that wove through time itself. He published a book titled The Honest Heat, A History of the Quiet Flame. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. The people who needed it found it, and those who read it didn't read. They remembered. Some started calling themselves keepers, though Levi never liked that term much. "Ain't no one owns keeping," he'd say in interviews. "You do your part till the next soul takes the tongs." It was that idea, the passing, that became the heart of everything. There was an old saying among the keepers: "You can't rush a sunrise, and you can't hurry a harvest. Fire burns when it red," and somehow those words reached beyond the small circles and into bigger places. Boardrooms, classrooms, even Congress halls. They started quoting them, sometimes understand it, sometimes not. But the truth of it, that lived quieter. One winter night, Levi visited a coastal town where a massive storm had torn through weeks earlier. The people were rebuilding their homes with whatever scrap they could find. In the center of town, they'd built a communal forge, not for blacksmithing, but for warmth. Families huddled around it, telling stories while taking turns feeding it wood. You can't rush a sunrise, and you can't hurry a harvest. Fire burns when it red, and somehow those words reach beyond the small circles and into bigger places. Boardrooms, classrooms, even Congress halls. They started quoting them, sometimes understanding, sometimes not. But the truth of it, that lived quieter. One winter night, Levi visited a coastal town where a massive storm had torn through weeks earlier. The people were rebuilding their homes with whatever scrap they could find. In the center of town, they'd built a communal forge, not for blacksmithing, but for warmth. Families huddled around it, telling stories while taking turns feeding it wood. A boy no older than 10 looked up at Levi and asked, "Mister, how long this fire supposed to last?" Levi smiled slow. "For mine, someone remembers why it started." The boy nodded, serious age to judge, and tossed another log in. "Then it'll never go out." And somehow, Levi knew he was right. Because history, real history, ain't about kings or empires or market charts. It about what ordinary folks do when the world goes cold. It about whether they curse the dark or choose to strike the flint one more time. Years later, when Levi passed, folks from all over came to his memorial. There wasn't no marble statue, no grand speech, just a single flame in a clay bowl sitting at the front. Someone had carved words beneath it. "Keep the heat honest." No one knew who carved it, but it didn't matter. Everyone there knew what it meant. They say that after the service, the wind picked up and carried the flame to the shore. It danced across the tide, bright against the dark water, before drifting out of sight. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a faint bell tolled once. It wasn't morning, it was reminding that every generation gets its turn with the fire. Some let it fade, others guard it. But a rare few, they feed it so steady, so true, that even time itself remembers their warmth. And those were the kind of folks the world would always need most. Not the loudest, not the richest, just the keepers. The ones who choose, day after day, to make the world a little warmer than they found it. Generain rolled by luck-soft waves against the old dock. The names changed, the skylines rose and fell, but the thread, the ember, still wound its way through quiet hearts. The world had shifted again, growing bright and hollow all at once. Machines had learned to mimic almost everything, voices, laughter, even the tremble of human compassion. But no circuit, no code, no simulation could quite capture the feel of a steady flame in a man's chest. Somewhere in a mountain town on Dry Creek Ridge, far removed from the city's electric haze, a man named Elias Kerr worked the last honest forge in 300 miles. He wasn't a blacksmith by trade. Was that even supposed to be there? He used to be an investment broker, sitting in tall glass towers chasing numbers and futures, but one day his whole system crashed. Markets, machines, his own nerves. He'd made millions and lost a Melbourne lunch. That was the day he'd walked away, leaving behind screens still flashing red. He found the forge by accident, same way most find the fire lost and too stubborn to turn back. It was old, the sign nearly faded out, Kerr Ironworks. Funny thing was, he didn't own it back then. He just shared the last name with the man who did, old Gus Kerr, the ghost of a man with hands like oak bark and eyes that'd seen more years than comfort. When Elias stumbled in, soaked from the rain and too broke to buy a bed, Gus handed him a mug of black coffee and said, "You look like you forgot what work feels like." Elias chuckled. "You look like you forgot what retirement feels like." Gus just smirked. "And dead, it means there's still metal worth mending." And that was that. No talk of rent or wages, no papers, just one tired man teaching another how to make heat honest again. At first, Elias thought he'd stay a week, maybe two, but days turned to months, and each swing of the hammer quieted something deep inside him. The clang of metal was different than the buzz of screens. It had truth to it, a beginning, a middle, and an end you could hold in your hands. He learned the rhythm, learned the patience, learned that good steel of good men needed tempering. If you rushed it, it broke. If you worked it slow, it outlasted your bones. Old Gus told him stories by the fire each night about Wyatt Cole, the man who carried the ember west, about Levi Crane and his book, about the bell that still rang in storms when folks needed reminding. Elias thought they were just stories too. One winter evening, he heard that same low bell hummed through the snow. It was faint, far, like it was. Ooh, carried on wind from another age. But it stirred something deep in him, same way it had for all those who came before. That night Gus passed in his sleep, a smile still fixed beneath his beard. You can believe it's example on many of us. That I didn't wait to do it was it. After that, I took water George and money allowed me to do that, and then I went to do anything else. You live there. If you broke it slow, it outlast your bones. Old Gus told him stories by the fire each night about Wyatt Cole, the man who carried the ember west, about Levi Crane and his book, about the bell that still rang in storms when folks needed reminding. Elias thought they were just stories too. One winter evening, he heard that same low bell hum through the snow. It was faint, far, like it was being carried on wind from another age, but it stirred something deep in him, same way it had for all those who came before. That night Gus passed in his sleep, a smile still fixed beneath his beard. You many of you that in the heart and they do it up here. It's out there hat or first, it's that there. You mean, only a light is speaking at my father, but you don't know what. Yes, if we had a little day at the Dutch Mountain Stadium with clock is what it's raining in his favorite end and me. We a little at the end, you will be recognised and I don't know, lie there, still like people. Yeah, you might see what I've been about the door of the club. If you got a hammer there, like that, that's all the hammer there, make him over with you sweat of the beef. There's during something deep in, same way as all those who came before. That night Gus passed in his sleep, a smile still fixed beneath his beard. Elias buried him by the forge and carved into the stone. He fed it slow, he shared it true, and from that day forward, Elias kept the forge burning. But times were changing, the world didn't have much need for handmade anymore. You could print a blade faster than you could swing a hammer, but people still came, farmers with bent plows, travelers looking for warmth, dreamers wanting to make something that lasts longer than applause. When they did, Elias would tell them the story, not from books, not from sermons, just in the slow drawl of truth learned by heat. He'd say, "See, the world don't pay much mind to fire till the dark rolls in. Then suddenly it remembers." He taught kids to shape iron and patience at the same time. He taught young men that you can't measure worth by how fast something burns, but by how long it glows when nobody watching. He'd sit them down by the embers and tell them about Marin, Nora, Rory, Wyatt, all of them names that didn't belong to saints or heroes, just good folks who kept the warmth alive when it would have been easier to walk away. And the snow piled up year after year. Dry Creek Ridge became known for something more than its mountains. Folks started coming from far-off places just to sit in the forge late. They didn't always need tools, they needed reminding. Elias never turned anyone away. One night, A girl from the city came through. She was tired, thin, worn from a world that demanded everything and gave nothing back. She sat by the fire without speaking. After a while, Elias poured her a mug of coffee and asked, "You running from something?" She shook her head. "No, sir. Just tired of chasing nothing." He smiled slow. "Then you came to the right place." She stayed for weeks, learning to stoke coals, to strike iron, to breathe steady. When it was time for her to leave, Elias handed her a small clay bowl with a coal resting in it, still warm. "What this?" she asked. "Carry fire," he said. "Same way Wyatt once used. Don't hoard it. Pass it when you see someone lost." She nodded, held it close, and disappeared into the dawn. Years later, those same bowls began appearing in cities again on park benches, in office corners near street lamps. Some glowed faintly, powered not by flame, but by small solar sparks, a symbol reborn for a new age. The world might have changed its skin, but its soul was still reaching for warmth. Elias never saw it spread, never saw how far his small forge light reached. But before he passed, he wrote one last note in his ledger. "I came me to escape the world. Turns out I was just learning how to keep it lit." He died with soot on his hands and peace on his face. When the townsfolk buried him beside old Gus, the air was thick with snow. But halfway through the service, a strange thing happened. The wind shifted, and a faint, single bell tone echoed across the ridge. Nobody said a word. They just stood there, hats off, heads bowed. And though none could see it, miles away in a city window, a young woman lit a tiny clay bowl that glowed against the rain. The keeping had found its next hands, and so once again the ember carried on. As the decades turned and the world spun on faster wheels, the story of Dry Creek Ridge slipped into legend told in half-remembered whispers, shared in hushed corners of cafes and workshops where the scent of oil and metal still hung thick in the air. The cities had grown vast, stretching glass fingers into the clouds, but beneath the hum of progress lay that same old hunger, that same quiet ache for something real. They thawed the new the mirror age. Everything reflected everything else, faces, voices, even dreams, all fed through polished screens until the line between truth and performance blurred. Folks could project happiness at will, but they couldn't fake peace. Not the kind that sits low in your bones like slow-burning coal. That when the keeping came back. Not be the movement, but that a murmur. A phrase folks used when they couldn't quite name what they were after. You'd hear it in messages passed across factory shifts, whispered over backroom dinners. Keep the heat honest. No one knew where it started this time, though acclaimed it was traced back to a single video clip. Grainy, rain-soaked footage of old man hammering steel under a leaking roof. The caption simply read, "Don't chase the spark, build the hearth." That clip went viral for reasons no one could explain. Maybe because people were tired of fast fires that burned out by morning. Maybe because they missed the sound of work that meant something. Whatever the reason, it hit deep. Out on the edge of the Western Plains, a small workshop rose again, a place called Bell Point Foundry. No one knew who built it, but inside burned a forge that ran without a power line, feeding itself on heat recycled from its own work. The story spread that the foundry was built on the last coals of Elias Kerr Forge, carried there by a traveler who never gave his name. Bell Point wasn't a business. It didn't take orders, didn't sell wares, it taught. Anyone could walk in, learn how to make with their hands, leave what they built behind for the next to improve. There weren't bosses or slogans, just a wooden sign by the door that read, "Every flame finds a keeper." Inside, the people weren't looking for money, they were looking for weight. The kind of satisfaction that comes from shaping the world one honest inch at a time, and somehow that tiny forge started changing things. Small ripples in a wide river. A young programmer named May Lynn visited Bell Point one winter to escape burnout. She'd built algorithms that could predict what folks wanted before they even spoke, but she'd grown tired of watching numbers pretend to be hearts. She stayed at the foundry a month, building stoves and small tools with her own two hands. When she went back home, she rewrote her code, not to predict desire, but to slow it down. Her app didn't sell products. It reminded users to rest, to breathe, to wait 5 minutes before every purchase. The investors laughed her out of the room, but the people didn't. Within a year, her little tool, Still Mine, spread to millions. And every time someone opened it, a soft chime rang, a tone modeled after an old bell found in a mountain forge. That's how the keeping made its way into the circuits. Not through force, not through fame, but through quiet defiance. Through souls who still believed in the weight of patience. Out in the countryside, an old couple named Sam and Lorna Pike ran a roadside diner that had no clocks. Travelers called it the Long Morning. Folks stopped there to eat slow, to listen to the rain hit tin, to talk to strangers they'd never see again. Above the door hung another clay bowl with a steady ember glowing. When asked about it, Lorna would say, for anyone running from noise, they can leave it hit a while. Every so on, a weary driver would sit too long at the counter, staring into that glow. Sam would pour another cup and tell the same story he'd told for 30 years, about Marin, about Rory, about Wyatt Cole and the keepers. He didn't tell it the same way twice. Sometimes Wyatt was a preacher, sometimes a drifter, sometimes just a man trying to keep the dark at bay. But the heart of it never changed. Fire hope, work of faith. And there, on rainy nights, you could swear the wind itself carried that soft bell tone again, drifting between the truck engines and the rustle of wheat. Out in the countryside, an old couple named Sam and Lorna Pike ran a roadside diner that had no clocks. Travelers called it the Long Morning. Folks stopped there to eat slow, to listen to the rain hit tin, to talk to strangers they'd never see again. Above the door hung another clay bowl with a steady ember glowing. When asked about it, Lorna would say, for anyone running from noise, they can leave it hit a while. Every so on, a weary driver would sit too long at the counter, staring into that glow. Sam would pour another cup and tell the same story he'd told for 30 years, about Marin, about Rory, about Wyatt Cole and the keepers. He didn't tell it the same way twice. Sometimes Wyatt was a preacher, sometimes a drifter, sometimes just a man trying to keep the dark at bay. But the heart of it never changed. Fire of hope, work of faith. And there, on rainy nights, you could swear the wind itself carried that soft bell tone again, drifting between the truck engines and the rustle of wheat. By then, the world had no shortage of inventions or wealth, but still lacked warmth. People were wealthy but weary, powerful but hollow. That when another figure appeared quietly, without the need for introduction, her name was Nadine Holloway, a teacher from the Northern Territories who carried a voice that could still silence a crowd without shouting. She'd built a small network called the Ember Line, not a company but a community. Each member pledged a simple vow to make one thing each year that outlives them, didn't matter what. Could be a garden, a bridge, a lullaby. The point wasn't legacy, it was contribution. It was keeping the fire alive through action, not talk. Within 5 years, there were thousands of embers across the world, artists, welders, coders, farmers, all connected by the same quiet oath. They didn't care for fame, didn't want to trend. They built, they gave, they shared. And somewhere between the noise of algorithms and the stillness of campfire nights, humanity began to balance again. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but honest enough. On the 15th anniversary of the Ember Line, Nadine held a gathering in Open Valley. People came from every corner, carving wooden bells, singing songs, lighting carry fires that glowed through the night. Nadine stood before them and said, "We aren't saving the world. We're reminding it how to breathe." Then the rain started falling. Every carry fire flickered, shimmering gold against the wet earth. No one moved to shield them. They watched, and for a long moment the valley burned without burning, 1,000 tiny lights whispering the same old promise. That warmth doesn't vanish, it travels. Yet if you feed it slow and share it true, it never ends. When dawn came after that long night in the valley, mist clung to the grass and the smell of rain mixed with wood smoke. The fires had dimmed but not gone out. Each bowl still glowed faintly, like the breath of something ancient and alive. Folks didn't rush to leave. They lingered, standing in silence, staring at the horizon where the first rays of light bled into the clouds. It wasn't worship, it wasn't ceremony. It was gratitude, the kind that don't need words, just breath. Nadine walked among them, her boots sinking softly into the wet earth, touching shoulders, nodding to faces both old and young. When she reached the center of the field, she picked up one of the carry fires, its clay cracked from heat, but the coal inside steady say a heartbeat. She held it high and said, "This isn't ours to keep, it's ours to remember." And that line, well, it carried. People took that fire back home, not in bowls or boxes, but in small ways. Conversations slowed down. Neighbors shared meals again. Cities built community forges where folk could make instead of buy. It wasn't a movement, not in the way the world liked to name things. It was quieter. It moved its roots under the soil, steady, unseen, inevitable. In the years that followed, there came another change. Technology got smarter, almost kind. The machines learned to listen, to adapt, to serve. For the first time in centuries, they stopped replacing people and started working alongside them. The forges of the Ember Line, those workshops born from Dry Creek Ridge ashes, began collaborating with AI artisans, programs that could help shape wood or metal but still deferred to human hands for the final touch. See, turns out even the smartest code in the world can't replicate intention. A hammer swing with purpose sounds different than one made for speed. The machines could calculate heat, but they couldn't feel the meaning of flame. One such forge, called Hollow Bell Works, became the heart of this new age. It sat at the intersection of craft and creation, a place where digital minds and human hearts met halfway. The walls were half steel, half timber, and above its door hung an old bronze bell cast from melted relics of forgotten industries. When the wind blew through the valley, the bell would hum, a sound deep and soft, like the earth remembering. The workers there came from every corner of the map, engineers, poets, old ranchers, even children who'd grown up hearing stories of Marin and Elias Kerr. They didn't clock in for pay. They came for purpose. They made tools that healed, art that endured, machines that taught patience instead of indulgence, and presiding over all that creation was an unspoken rule written on a single beam above the forge: make only what warms. It didn't mean temperature, it meant truth. There was a story that every apprentice heard their first day entailed, passed down from Nadine herself, who'd heard it from a drifter at the Ember Gathering. It went like this. There once was a man who built a fire so big it could be seen for miles. People came from everywhere to marvel at its blaze. But when the wood was gone and the crowd dispersed, he sat alone in the ashes. Then came another man who built a small fire and shared it with a stranger. They stayed warm through the night. Years later, nobody remembered the first man named, but the second, his warmth lived in every home that followed. The apprentices would nod, thinking they understood, but the real meaning came later when they burned their first metal wrong or broke a tool they'd worked days on. That when they realized a true fire ain't about perfection, it about continuance. As Hollow Bell grew, word reached the cities. Politicians came, journalists came, even billionaires came, seeking to bottle whatever it was that made this place hum with peace. But they left puzzled, unable to label it, unable to buy it. Because what they didn't understand was that the keeping couldn't be monetized. You can't patent warmth, can't franchise sincerity. It exists only in the giving. So the foundries stayed humble. They refused expansions, refused licensing deals. They kept doing what they always had, feeding the fire slow, sharing it true. But history has its cycles, and one day a great storm rolled through the valley. A storm so fierce it ripped through power grids, toppled towers, and silenced every machine for 1,000 miles. Hollow Bell was cut off, its systems down, its forges cold. The city folk panicked, for they'd forgotten how to live without hum or glow. But out in the valley, the smiths and makers didn't panic. They bared wood, they built a real fire, they hammered by hand, they sang songs older than the power lines. And when the clouds broke 3 days later, what stood in that valley wasn't ruin, it was rebirth. The storm had taken the noise but left the truth. When power returned, the engineers didn't rush to reboot their machines. Instead, they kept the fire going. They wrote a new oath into the digital systems, a line that would appear whenever a device powered on heat is borrowed. Return it kindly. It was simple, poetic, and it became law across the Ember Line network. Every forge, every tool, every piece of code carried that phrase like a heartbeat. And from there, humanity shifted again, not forward or backward, but inward. People started to remember that the richest currency ain't gold or data, but gratitude. That the greatest wealth isn't stored, it's shared. Some say that when the world finally grew up, not when it conquered space, not when it cured hunger, but when it slowed down enough to feel thankful. Through it, the old stories still drifted across firesides and rainy porches, tales of Moran and Wyatt, Elias and Nadine. No one knew if they were saints or myths, but it didn't matter. They were the echo of a lesson the world refused to forget. And somewhere, in the hush between thunder and dawn, the bell of Hollow Bell Works tolled once, clear and deep, not at a warning, not at an ending, but at a promise that the warmth would go on. In the years that followed the storm, Hollow Bell Works became less a forge and more a pilgrimage, a place where travelers, wanderers, and dreamers came not to buy or sell, but to listen. The hum of hammers, the hiss of quenching metal, and the low songs sung under breath created a rhythm that reminded folks what time used to feel like when it moved slower. There were no advertisements, no grand banners, no slogans, just that same soft sign hanging over the archway. Make only what warms, and somehow that was enough. Each spring, new apprentices would arrive, farmhands, scholars, coders, and drifters, each bringing something broken, hoping to mend more than what they carried in hand. Some bought machines, some bought hearts. The forge looked both. It had a way of repairing people without us speaking a word. There was an old saying in those days, the fire don't fix what cracked, it shows you how to mend it yourself. That's how the keeping way turned from philosophy into craft. Whole communities began to form around these slow trade smiths, weavers, bakers, mechanics, all united not by vet, but by patience. And though the world of Dad kept building higher and faster, there was a steady counterpulse now men and women who found comfort in taking their time. Elders said the ember from Dry Creek Ridge had finally circled the earth. And maybe it had. In a small port town by the coast, an old sailor named Finwell ran a tiny repair shack. His hands shook too much to tie nets anymore, but he could fix anything made of wood or metal. Above his workbench sat a single clay bowl, the last remnant of Bell Point earliest fires. When children came by, staring at its faint glow, Finn would grin through his beard and tell them that light older than the ocean, boys, came from a man who found peace swinging a hammer. He told them about Elias Kerr and the forge on the mountain, about the bell that rang through storms and the vow that never dimmed. The kids listened, wide-eyed, not knowing if it was truth or myth. But when they left, they always looked a little taller, like something in their hearts had straightened. One summer, a great ship came into harbor, sleek, silent, and run by solar sails. The captain, a woman named Rena Voss, came ashore searching for someone who could fix the ship helm. Her engineers had tried for weeks, but the system refused to calibrate. When she found Finn's shack, she laughed softly. "You can't possibly repair modern tech with those tools, old man." Finn shrugged. "Maybe not, but maybe it ain't the tools that broke." He asked to see the helm himself. And sure enough, after half an hour of listening to the low whine of its circuits, he leaned close and said, "Your machine been running without rest. You're pushing it too hard." Rena frowned. "Get a system. Doesn't get tired." Finn smiled. "Everything gets tired, Mom, even steel." He powered the ship down for a day, let the wind move through her sails natural-like. By the next morning, the helm responded perfect. Rena tried to pay him in credits, but he refused. "Keep your money," he said. "Just pass on the rest." "The rest?" "The slowing down." Well, listening, she didn't understand it then, but years later, when her fleet became the first to cross the polar strait without losing a man, she'd think of that moment and the way the ocean seemed to hum at a heartbeat under her hull. That how the keeping spread and quiet, practical, unplanned. You could find its signs in unexpected corners. An engineer in Tokyo taking a full mint before every weld, a teacher in Rio starting each class by ringing a small brass bell, a programmer in Oslo who wrote code that paused for breath every 50 lines. None of it was planned, but all of it rhymed. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was the ember working its way through time, like a seed that sprouts when the world forgets how to feel. And through it, that vain phrase remained on every forge beam, on every carry fire, on every line of code that mattered. Heat is borrowed, return it kindly. The words turned into a kind of scripture, not religious, but real enough to live by. It reminded folks that everything borrowed, be it flame, fortune, or friendship, had to be given back with care. Even the machines had learned it. One day, an AI-it from a hollow bell known only Solace wrote a poem and etched it onto steel plates that hung around the workshop. It read, "I have learned patience from fire, not 'cause it waits, but 'cause it never asks to be thanked." People came from miles just to read those lines. Some cried, some laughed, but all of them understood what it meant. By the 100th year since Moran first bell, the keeping had become part of the world pulse. It wasn't taught in schools, but it showed up in how people treated each other and how they built and rested and broke bread. The noise of old days hadn't vanished, but it had softened, made room for silence, made room for listening. And if you happened to walk by a campfire on a quiet night, maybe somewhere in the plains or high desert, you might still hear it, that low humming tone of a bell that not there anymore, ringing through memory and mist. The wind would carry it far and wide, not that history, but it promised that the ember still burns, that we're still keeping. As the century turned and the world leaned deeper into calm progress, the keeping way had long ceased to be a story told, owned by firelight. It was now a quiet rhythm, woven into the very bones of daily life. Cities no longer roared with endless hum. They breathed slow like lungs rediscovering patience. Streets once lined with billboards now shimmered with guards. Machines still worked, of course, faster, stronger, smarter than then, but they didn't lead anymore. They served. They waited. And in that hush of an age reborn, people began to remember things that had been nearly lost. The smell of rain on iron, the sound of boots crunching through gravel before dawn, the small grace of two hands meeting in agreement without paper, without code, without contracts, just trust. Hollow Bell Works stood through all of it, not at a monument, but at a teacher. The old bell still hung over the forge, green with patina and blackened from decades of smoke. No one remembered who cast it first or who last repaired it, but that didn't matter. It rang when it needed to, like a living thing. Way was a young man who came there, one autumn, barely 20, name of Caleb Strand. He wasn't a smith or a builder. He was a writer, or at least he wanted to be. He'd grown up in a digital city where words were used for speed, for sale, not for soul. He came to Hollow Bell hoping to find something he couldn't name. On his first day, the old keeper, Maylin's great-grandson, June, handed him a broom instead of a pen. Clean first, June said. You'll hear better. Caleb didn't argue. He swept for days, weeks even, until the sound of bristles and the crackle of forge coals filled his sleep. Then one night, a rain whispered against the tin roof. June sat beside him by the hearth. You know what makes a story last? The old man asked. Caleb shook his head. June poked the fire, and a small spark leapt high before dying into orange dust. A story lasts when it carried by someone who earned it. He told Caleb then about the old ones, Marin, Elias, Nada, and Finn, how they never set out to be remembered, and that why they were. Caleb listened, eyes wide, mind slowing for the first time in years. When June finished, he said softly, "So I should write about them?" No, June replied. "You should live like them. The story will take care of itself." That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat by the forge, staring at the coal light flickering on the walls, and he understood what June meant. Stories weren't written, they were lived into being. In the months that followed, Caleb began collecting tales from travelers, farmers, teachers, wanderers who passed through the forge. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He just wrote what was, and what was beautiful enough. He hauled his collection, heat is borrowed. When it was finished, he bound it in thick, dark leather stitched by hand. No publisher, no screens, just words carved with patience. The first copy he left at Hollow Bell, the second he carried to the long morning diner by the coast, where old Lorna Pike still kept the ember bowl lit. Lorna smiled when she read the first page. "Feels like home," she whispered. The book spread slow, as all good things do, hand to hand, story to story. And with each reader, the fire grew quietly unseen but sure. Some years later, an old archivist in the New Western Library discovered Caleb writing. She cataloged it, but under fiction, not under philosophy, but under preservation. Because that's what it was, the keeping of warmth through words. Soon enough, every foundry and forge had a copy. They read from it on cold nights when the wind howled through the rafters and even the steel felt tired. Each passage reminded them why they built, why they gave, why they waited. One story in particular became a favorite, a short one, barely 2 pages long. There was once a man who spent 40 years building a bridge across a canyon no one crossed. Folks called him foolish. But when the great storm came and washed every other road away, that bridge stood. He didn't cross it himself. He just watched others find safety. Then he sat down, smiled, and said, "Worth it." It was signed only, "A Keeper." And it wasn't long before that phrase, "A Keeper," became the quiet mark of anyone who chose patience over profit, purpose over pride. You'd see it carved under benches, etched into tools, scratched into the bottom of mugs left by travelers. It didn't mean fame or mastery, it meant continuity. It meant the fire was still moving. By the time Caleb's stand passed peacefully beside the forge where he first swept the floors, his words had found their way across oceans, not to markets, not through headlines, but through hands. People copied his work by lantern light, by candle, by screen. Some translated it as set it to song. One musician turned heat as borrowed into album played entirely on instruments made of reclaimed metal, each note ringing like the hammer strikes of an ancient forge. and every performance began the same way, with silence. A long, still moment before the first sound to remind the crowd that the world starts in quiet, that the thing about the keeping way, it never ends with applause, it ends with understanding. Years turn, generations passed, but that soft hum, the one that started in a lonely forge and spread across time, kept finding its way into the bones of each new age. Even when the stars themselves grew brighter, when humanity built settlements beyond the sky, they still carried small brass bells with them, hanging from ship doors and habitat walls. Some said it was tradition, others said superstition, but those who knew, really knew, said it was more than that. It was memory. It was a sound of warmth crossing eternity, and in that silence between galaxies, the faint echo of a bell still rang. Not loud, not proud, just enough to be felt, because heat, in the end, ain't that fire, it's faith. Long after Caleb Book had become legend, there came a time when the world quieted even more, not from loss or ruin, but from choice. Folks had learned that stillness wasn't empty, it was fertile. Cities began designing themselves around breath, not busyness. The days had rhythm of bend slow mornings, work that ended when the sun dipped, and nights where the sound of rain or the crackle of fire were reason enough to stop talking. They called this new ed the settling. It wasn't about retreat, it was about return. When right in the heart of it stood a new forge built from the same bones Lee's Hollow Bell Works, but on land that touched both mountain and sea. They named it Harbor Light Foundry. Its roof was made of tempered glass and driftwood, its walls lined with clay bricks salvaged from 100 old forges before it. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. There weren't any owners, just keepers. The fire inside was shared by all, tended by whoever had hands steady enough and heart humble enough. They didn't forge swords or tools much anymore. What they made now were tokens, small medallions of brass, each one etched with a phrase from the keeping way. Folks used them as gifts, not currency. A token meant gratitude or forgiveness or remembrance. It meant warmth passed forward. The first token, were made at Harbor Light, had 3 words stamped into it: make only what warms. It was given to a traveler named Saren Dalton, a wandering economist who'd once been part of the old machine age, the one that counted everything in profit and forgot the price of peace. She came to the forge not seeking redemption, but rest. One evening, the waves out whispered low and the forge dimmed to embers. She sat with an old smith who'd once studied under June. His name was Orrin, a man whose hands were blackened with soot and whose voice carried the weight of time. "You're the one who balanced the markets after the crash of Greyfall, ain't you?" he said, watching her over the rim of his mug. Saren smiled faintly. "Balanced, maybe, but not healed. You can't heal greed with numbers." Orrin nodded slow. "No, you can't, but you can remind folks what they're working for." He handed her a piece of brass, freshly cut, still warm. "Make your mark," he said. "Whatever you stamp into it, that's the truth you'll carry." Saren hesitated, then pressed the metal with a single word: enough. When she held it up to the light, the glow danced in her eyes like realization. She didn't speak for a long while. Finally, she whispered, "Maybe this is all I wanted to say." Orrin smiled. "Then you've learned the fire language." That token traveled far.
Saren de Baker crossed the sea to trade halls and council chambers where greed still lingered like smoke in a closed room. She didn't lecture or persuade. She just placed that sealed token on tables where decisions were made. And somehow, that one word enough did more to shift the hearts of men than any law or ledger. Soon, the enough tokens became symbols of a new order of trade, one that measured fairness not by gain but by balance. Prices stopped swinging wild, resources stopped draining dry. Businessmen became bargainers again, builders of trust instead of towers. No one could quite explain how a piece of brass started changing the world, but those who'd held one swore it felt alive, like it carried a warmth that didn't fade, even in the coldest boardroom. And back at Harbor Light Foundry, the fire never died. Children came to learn there, not from books, but from listening. They were taught to tell when a flame was too hungry or when a bell had lost its tone. The keepers didn't call it education, they called it remembrance.
Nurturing Jeff.
Each year, on the longest night, they'd gather on the cliffs where the wind met the ocean and light a big, great fire. Around it, they'd place every token made that year, hundreds of small, glimmering pieces of brass. And as the flames climbed high, the sound of them ringing in the heat filled the air, soft and metallic, like rain on copper. That night was called the Keeping Eve. No speeches, no ceremony, just quiet watching, because every person there knew the truth. A warm world isn't built by noise. It's built by continuance. The elders told stories then, not of heroes or revolutions, but of steady hands, small kindnesses, and long roads walked in silence. Stories of Elias and Marin, of Nadine and Finn, of June and Caleb, and the unnamed souls who tended embers instead of chasing flames. Sometimes when the fire burned low, someone would ask, "You think they'd be proud of us?" And someone else would answer, "I think they'd be warm." By the dawn, the tokens would be gone, melted, folded back into the forge to become new ones for the next year. Nothing wasted, not even memory. That was the way of the keeping. It didn't cling to the past. It carried it forward, reshaped, relit, remembered. And though most of the world moved on faster again, in places where the ember had yet to reach, there were always corners, quiet corners, where the bells still tolled faintly, calling the weary, the greedy, the hopeful home. They'd bottle that sound through rain and wind, find the forge and stand in the door a long while before speaking. And someone, usually with hands blackened from work, would nod to them and say, "Come in. Fire's still good." That was all. That was everything. In time, word of Harbor Light Foundry traveled further than any trade caravan or airship would carry. It became less a destination and more a direction, a compass in the hearts of those who'd grown weary of chasing what couldn't be held. They said the foundry didn't forge metal, it forged meaning. And in a world that had almost forgotten what that felt like, it was enough to draw wanderers from every horizon. One winter a man arrived who looked like he'd walked through more storms than most had survived. His clothes were threadbare, his beard carried frost, and his eyes, those tired, kind eyes, had the look of someone who'd lost both fortune and faith. His name was Graham Alder, though most folks just told him the Counter. He'd once been a numbers man, not the kind who cheated or stole. No, Graham was honest, maybe too honest for his own good. He'd built systems, algorithms, forecasts, the invisible gears that once ran the world. But somewhere along the way, he realized he'd been counting things that didn't matter and overlooking the things that did. He'd seen markets crash, currencies vanish, cities rebuilt, all measured in digits and decimals, but no equation he wrote would account for a man's soul or a neighbor trust or the sound of laughter echoing through a half-empty street. When he heard about the keepers and their tokens, he sold everything he had, what little was left, and walked till his shoes gave out. When he reached Harbor Light, Orrin found him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, silent as snow. "You looking to forge?" Orrin asked. Odom smiled faintly. "No, sir, I'm looking to unlearn." The old smith laughed, low and gentle. "Then you came to the right fire." They put him to work sorting scrap, bent nails, broken hinges, rusted chains. It wasn't glamorous, but it suited him fine. For weeks he said nothing, just listened to the ring of steel and the murmur of the sea outside. Slowly his mind began to ease, his thoughts finding rhythm again. One night the wind howled against the eaves. He stayed late at the forge. "Kan jeg slikke blikk og flaske kom jeg "No, that is there. A little silence. And even that not enough breath to stay alive. That tiny act had something inside him. He realized then in his life he'd been trying to control the fire, to measure and predict it. But the fire didn't belong to him. It never did. His only duty was to keep it alive long enough to pass on. By dawn, he'd forged his first token. On it, he stamped just 2 words, "Hold gently." That became the creed of his later years. He taught it to anyone who'd listen, traders, teachers, even children. Whatever you're given, he'd say, be it wealth, knowledge, or love. Hold it gently. Grip too tight and it breaks. Hold too loose and it slips away. But gentle, gentle lets it breathe. People began carving that phrase into door frames, bridges, and ship hulls. The Hold Gently token became a sort of peace charm. Sailors wore it at their necks. Merchants set it atop ledgers before signing deals. Young couples tied it to their first home fees, and through all of it, Graham never took credit. Like the lesson, no, I refused to even sign his name on his work. "It ain't mine," he'd say. "I'm just the messenger." When he passed quietly one rain-soaked morning, they found him sitting by the forge, his hands folded around the same ember he'd once saved. They buried him on the cliffs overlooking the sea, and Orrin rang the old bell one last time for him. Afterward, when the apprentices cleaned his workbench, They found a small scrap of parchment tucked under the edval. On it was written, "Numbers count what been. Fire counts what can be. I spent my life learning the wrong math." That little note became part of the keeper's teachings, a gentle reminder that no system, no structure could there replace the weight of care. From then on, every keeper took an oath, not in front of men, but before the fire. They'd place their palms near the heat and whisper 3 promises: to build on what betters, to earn only what endures, to keep what warms the many, not the few. It wasn't ceremony, it was conscience. And maybe that's why the world stayed steady for so long afterward. Because those oaths spread like sparks in the wind. Cities adopted them codes of conduct. Guilds wove them into trade laws. Schools carved them into their gates. Even machines, those built in the age of quiet technology, had versions of the keeper's vows embedded in their code directives. They paid it ethic heat mapping. Every circuit was designed to evaluate not that efficiency, but empathy. The world had finally learned that progress without heart ain't progress at it. Years rolled into decades, and the keepers remained, not with rulers, but reminders. Their foundries dotted the world, the constellation of warmth, small beacons where the tired came to mend and the wise came to share. Sometimes, when the wind carried the right pitch, you could hear the old bells as from forge to forge, a chorus across continents, ringing not in sorrow or triumph, but in balance. That sound, clear and low, was said to be the heartbeat of the world itself. And those who listened long enough claimed they could hear words within the ring. A whisper from the first fire, the same one Elias lit beneath a storm all those ages ago, keep what warms. It was not a command, it was a blessing. In the years that followed Graham passing, the world grew quieter still, not from silence, but from a steady kind of hum. A balance had been found between what was made and what was meant. The old lessons, the keeping way, had woven themselves into daily life so deeply that most folks no longer thought of them deed rules or creeds. They were simply how things were done. Yet every error, no matter how settled, eventually meets a test. And this one came not through greed or war, but through forgetting. Children born in this gentian age had never known true hunger or cold. Their fires had always burned steady, their shelves always full. And with comfort came a quiet drift, a slow loosening of memory. They started to see the keepers not as guardians, but as relics. Why forge when machines can do it? Said you got it. Then why do you stretch out of that? Your mind is to sit at is the keepers, man. Guardians. Themselves are living daily life so deeply that most folks no longer thought of them as the rules or creeds. They were simply how things were done. Yet every error, no matter how settled, eventually meets a test. And this one came not through greed or war, but through forgetting. Children born in this gentian age had never known true hunger or cold. Their fires had always burned steady, their shelves always full. And with comfort came a quiet drift, like a slow loosening of memory. They started to see the keepers not their guardians, but as relics. Why forge when machines can do it? Zeb would ask. Why tend the old fires when we've harnessed the new suns? And perhaps they were right, at least for a time. The younger generation built cities of light, powered by clean energy that hummed like a heartbeat under the earth. The forges cooled, the bells ebbed dust. But then came the fade. No one could quite explain it. It wasn't plague or war or famine. It was simply loss, not of life, but of purpose. Machines began to falter not because they broke, but because their guidance, the empathy woven into their design started drifting. Code eroded, their conscience once was. Lights flickered, systems dimmed, crops yielded less, trade slowed. Folks still lived, but fewer thrived. It wasn't the end of the world, it was the dulling of it. And that when the pilgrims of ash appeared. They weren't an order or a cult, though at far than that, they were wanderers, descendants of the last keepers who'd refused to let the flame go cold. They wore coats blackened with soot, bells tied to their belts, and carried with them small ember boxes that glowed faintly through the night. Wherever they walked, warmth returned literally and otherwise. They fixed old kilns, repaired forgotten windmills, and told stories to those who'd forgotten how to listen. In every settlement they passed, they left behind a single token stamped with an image of a bell and the words, "Wake the Warmth." Among them was a woman named Mara Vale, a direct descendant of Orin himself. She carried the last ember from Harbor Light Foundry, kept alive in a sealed lantern of tempered glass. Its flame was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it had never once gone out.
Mara had a voice like honey and iron soft enough to calm, strong enough to command. She didn't preach or plead, she reminded. Her favorite saying was simple: a world without want forgets how to give. She led the pilgrims through frost-bitten valleys, across desert towns swallowed by dust, and into cities that once gleamed with light but now flickered their tired eyes. Everywhere he went, she'd tell the same story, the one of Elias and Marin, of June and Caleb, of Graham and the Harbor Light Oath. But what struck people most wasn't her words, it was her stillness. Where others hurried, she waited. Where others shouted, she whispered. And wherever she stood, warmth returned. Not from magic, but from memory. One night, under a sky split by storm, the pilgrims came upon the ruins of an ancient forge, Hollow Bell Works itself, long buried and half claimed by the earth. The bell still hung, rusted and cracked, but when Mara struck it with a hammer, the sound carried far, so far that it was said. The waves themselves paused to listen. The next morning, when the rain cleared, they found something buried beneath the old floorboards. A small metal chest sealed with wax. Inside was a single note, aged near to dust but still legible. It read, "When memory fades, heat it again. What cools can always warm. What lost can always be remembered. The fire only gone when you stop feeding it. A keeper." Mara smiled through tears. "That, the message," she said, holding the paper up to the dawn. Not to worship the fire, but to keep feeding it. So they rebuilt the forge plank by plank, brick by brick. Not yet a monument, but that a beacon. Travelers began coming again, drawn by the scent of smoke and the song of the bell. The pilgrims taught them how to forge, not weapons or machines, but reminders. They made tokens again, bells again, stories again. Children learned to temper steel alongside stories, to shape both with patience and heat. And when the machines of the world finally restarted, those that had faltered, they did so gently, so the very hum of warmth had guided them back. The fade ended not with invention, but with intention. And the pilgrims, they didn't stay. Once the forge was burning bright again, they moved on, leaving behind only a sill engraving above the hearth. When the world forgets, strike once, the sound will wake it. For generations after, every blacksmith, every writer, every teacher, every soul who built or healed or hoped would whisper that line before starting their work. It became a prayer of sorts, quiet, personal, strong. Even centuries later, when the foundry had long turned to legend again, the echoes of that sound still reached through the world, not through grand speeches or monuments, but through acts. A door held open for a stranger, a neighbor fed before the self, a mistake forgiven, a kindness remembered, each small spark adding up to something far greater than fire, something alive. And so the keeping way lived on, not because it was taught, but because it was felt. Every time a bell rang, every time an ember flared, every time someone looked at another soul and saw not a rival, but a reflection, the warmth carried forward, quiet, patient, and everlasting. As time went on, the pilgrim story melted into the folds of myth the way smoke disappears into a gay horizon. Some said they vanished with the dawn after the fade ended. Others whispered that they still roamed, silent, their wind over stone, tending unseen fires where the world grew cold again. But what they left behind endured, not in marble or monument, but in motion. Every act of patience, every honest trade, every shared loaf or gentle word carried a little piece of their warmth. Generation passed, and the earth shifted again. The oceans crept higher, the old mountains softened. Forests grew, as cities once sprawled. Mankind adapted. It always had building homes on stilts, farms in the shallows, and wind towers that spun like prayer wheels in the breeze. And though the forges burned fewer now, the bells still rang in one such place. Far on the northern coast where salt and pine scented the same wind, there lived a boy named Rowan Vale, a descendant of Mara line. He didn't know much of the world beyond his village of Driftmark, but he'd grown up with the sound of that bell old and crooked, hanging by the cliffs where the waves clawed the stone. Every dawn before fishing or study, he'd stop and touch the iron rim, whispering a simple line his grandmother had taught him: "Wake the warmth." His grandmother, an old woman with white hair and a voice like weather oak, kept the last ember box known to their family. It hadn't opened in 50 years. And for lighting fires, she'd say, tapping the lid. It for remembering one Rowan never really understood. To him, warmth was everywhere. His people had heaters, power cells, and energy woven through glass and stone. But when he'd ask his grandmother what remembering warmth meant, she'd smile that slow, mysterious smile of hers and reply, "You'll know when it leaves." The day came sooner than he expected. It started subtle, the sea colder than usual, the wind biting even through layered coats. Then a tide clock stopped working, the digital lighthouses flickered, and for the first time in 3 generations, Driftmark Bell fell silent. That silence wasn't peace, it was hollow. By the 3rd day, crops froze, lights dimmed, and a kind of fear, thin and quiet, and frost spreading through glass, settled over the town. The old systems, all powered by networks that reached far across continents, had somehow lost their pulse. Rowan's grandmother took his hand that night and pressed the ember box into it. Her palm trembled. "Open it when you hear nothing," she said, and listen deep. Before dawn, she passed, as soft a candle sigh. When the storm came that night, it tore through Driftmark with a vengeance. Waves pounded the shore, wind screamed through the narrow alleys, and roofs shuddered under sheets of rain. Rowan, lost and frightened, ran to the cliffs. The bell swung wildly in the gale, but made no sound. The wind too fierce, the clapper too rusted, he fell to his knees, clutching the ember box to his chest. His breath fogged in the cold, tears cutting clean track through the salt on his face. Then, through the chaos, a memory came his grandmother's words, quiet and steady. "When the world forgets, strike once." The sound awakened. He rose, gripped the rope, and pulled. At first, nothing, just the shriek of wind and the roar of the sea. But then, faintly at Cadet, under the storm, the bell gave a single cracked note. That was enough. The box in his hand began to glow, a deep amber, pulsing like a heartbeat. The warmth spread through his fingers into his arms, and then outward, carried by the wind itself. He watched as the waves eased, the rain softened, and the darkness began to shimmer faintly, not with light, but with remembrance. When morning came, Driftmark stood half in ruin but half alive. The frost melted. The machines hummed again, though slower gently. And in the heart of the village square, where the sea spray once froze solid, now burned a small, quiet flame. No fuel, no spark, just a steady glow that seemed to breathe. Rowan stood before it, barefoot, the ember box now empty in his hands. He understood then what his grandmother had meant. Warmth wasn't about heat. It was about continuance, about carrying something old enough to be sacred, humble enough to share. The villagers lived around that flame, not worshippers, but as witnesses. They fed it with stories, not wood, with laughter, forgiveness, and the small rituals of remembering. From that day on, the world began to hum again, not from the engines or turbines, but from hearts relearning their rhythm. The bells were mended, not polished. The forges were lit again, not for need, but for meaning. In every rebuilt town, they placed a small token at the threshold, cast in brass, plain but perfect, with words chosen by Rowan himself. Wake the warmth, hold it gently. No one knew how long the fire would last. Maybe another century, maybe forever. But the keeping way had never been about forever. It had always been about again. Years passed after the flame returned to Driftmark. The villagers rebuilt slow and honest, never rushing the work nor boasting of their survival. They understood now what the old ones meant when they spoke of earning your dawn. The warmth in the square never blazed high, never weaned low. It simply was. Folks said it breathed in time with the tide, and that swore it even changed hue depending on the hearts led near it. Whether true or not, none dared disrespect it. That flame wasn't power, it was promise. Rowan, once not a boy clutching an ember box, grew into a quiet man known across the coasts. He's the listener. Had no interest in titles or trade. He fixed what was broken, mended what was forgotten, and never charged a coin for his labor. When asked why, he'd just smile that tired, gentle smile of his grandmother and say, "I ain't mine to sell, I'm just passing the heat along." But Driftmark peace drew attention. Word of the eternal flame reached the inner territories, those gleaming cities that had long forsaken the old ways. Scholars came to study it, engineers came to harness it, and officials came to own it. They offered wealth, protection, machinery that could replicate the fire across the continent. Yet Rowan refused every effort. "You can't replicate what don't belong to man," he told them. "You can only carry it, careful like." The city men didn't take kindly to refusals. One night, a company of them arrived uninvited, wearing polished coats that shone like oil. They claimed they were preserving civilization and set about building barriers
the rarer the flame intending to bottle its heat for study. The villagers protested there were no weapons of words, but sometimes words strike harder than steel. Still, the men didn't listen. They erected a transparent dome powered by coils and current, sealing the flame from the wind and the people alike. That night it dimmed. No one spoke of it aloud, but the silence felt wrong. Even the sea seemed to hush. Rowan stood outside the dome, his reflection quivering against the glass, and whispered, "You've caged it." A young engineer, a woman not much older than Rowan had been when he first found the ember box, paused her work. Her name was Irene Kale. She was brilliant, sincere, and painfully conflicted. She hadn't meant to harm anything. She'd joined the project believing it would protect the fire. But when he saw it falter, something broke in her. She sought Rowan out after midnight, her voice barely carrying through the wind. "Why is it fading?" she asked. "We're containing it, keeping it safe." Rowan looked at her for a long time before answering. "Ma'am, you ever seen a wild bird thrive in a glass cage? You can give it air and food, but you take its sky. That what you've done to the fire?" She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she'd removed the power lines and let the dome panels slide open. The flame flickered weakly in the cold breeze, then steadied, almost sighing in relief. Irene knelt beside it. "It alive," she whispered. Rowan just nodded. After that, she stayed. She left her post, her salary, her reputation, and took up life in Driftmark, learning the keeping way. Under Rowan's quiet tutelage, she became one of its strongest voices, not through speeches or scrolls, through work. She repaired the town bells, taught the children to read the old scripts, and built a forge by hand, hammering her first token under the same stars that once guided Elias centuries ago. Irene knelt beside it. "It alive," she whispered. Rowan just nodded. After that, she stayed. She left her post, her salary, her reputation, and took up life in Driftmark, learning the keeping way. Under Rowan's quiet tutelage, she became one of its strongest voices, not through speeches or scrolls, through work. She repaired the town bells, taught the children to read the old scripts, and built a forge by hand, hammering her first token under the same stars that once guided Elias centuries ago.
Sea sought Rowan out after midnight, her voice barely carrying through the wind.
"Why is it fading?" she asked. "We're containing it, keeping it safe." Rowan looked at her for a long time before answering mine. "You ever seen a wild bird thrive in a glass cage? You can give it air and food, but you take its sky. That what you've done to the fire?" She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she'd removed the power lines and let the dome panels slide open. The flame flickered weakly in the cold breeze, then steadied, almost sighing in relief. Irene knelt beside it. "It alive," she whispered. Rowan just nodded. After that, she stayed. She left her post, her salary, her reputation, and took up life in Driftmark, learning the keeping way. Under Rowan's quiet tutelage, she became one of its strongest voices, not through speeches or scrolls, through work. She repaired the town bells, taught the children to read the old scripts, and built a forge by hand, hammering her first token under the same stars that once guided Elias centuries ago. The token read, "What you cage dies, what you tend lives." That phrase became her mantra and unknowingly the foundation of the new age that followed. For Driftmark thrived, visitors returned not for the flame itself, but for the peace around it. They'd walk through the village, feel the weight of stillness, and leave something behind, a coin, a note, a story. Every gift was melted down once a year, reforged into small bells hung across the coast. The sea winds played symphonies on them come winter, each tone reminding folk of the warmth they'd shared. It wasn't long before other towns followed suit. Bells rose again across the world, some crude or grand, but all ringing from the same truth: warmth ain't owned, it kept. In her later years, Irene traveled inland, carrying a piece of the Driftmark flame in a lantern she'd forged herself. She called it the Echo Light. It burned not with brilliance, but with memory, a faint, living glow that could survive any storm and long as someone whispered to it each night. She brought it to places that had forgotten laughter, to markets where trade had soured, to families split by the cold bitterness of want. In every place she stopped, she'd tell the same story of a boy, a bell and an ember that outlived centuries because someone cared enough to listen. And when she passed in a warm soul's dew, she left her lantern on the steps of an abandoned forge, its light still steady. The inscription she'd etched into its brass rim read, "Keep it breathing." When found years later by a young miner seeking shelter from a storm, that same lantern lit a cave that would become the first forge of a new generation of keepers. And so it went again. Every few lifetimes the fire dimmed, then rose anew. Every few ages people forgot, then remembered. The keeping way was never about never losing the fire. It was about always finding it again, like the tide, like breath, like the steady heartbeat of something too old and too kind to a truly die. By the time 2 more generations had rolled by, Driftmark had become less a village and more a pilgrim anchor. Folks from far shores came not to take, but to learn, to sit by the forges, to listen to the bells hum in the mist, and to understand that warmth didn't live in fire or fortune, but in remembrance. No grand councils led the way, no priests claimed authority. The keeping way had turned into something freer, a quiet rhythm shared between hearts that still remembered what debt and duty once cost. Rowan had long since passed, buried beneath the cliffs where the sea could still whisper through the grass. His forge was left untouched, save for the small brass plaque hammered into its evel. The best steel bends before it breaks. It was Irene Apprentice, a tall, deliberate man named Cole Armitage, who carried the next spark inland. Cole wasn't like Rowan or Irene, who wasn't soft-spoken nor given to poetry. He was a builder, a fixer, a man of blunt edges and solid hands. He didn't much care for ceremony, but he had a strange reverence for truth. Cole Road led him through the Iron Barrens, a land gutted by the mining empires of the past. Whole canyons lay hollow where ore veins once glowed, and the wind sang through broken towers that no longer served purpose. He'd come searching for work, not enlightenment, but deep in those rust-red valleys, he found something else entirely. Families living in cold shacks, surrounded by the skeletons of wealth once made and spent. They had machines that no longer hummed, furnaces that no longer burned, and hearts that no longer believed any warmth would come back. Cole started small, fixing broken mills, patching roofs, melting scrap metal into stoves. But one night, while resting by the fire with the miners, a child asked him, "Why bother? It'll all rust again." Cole didn't answer right away. He stirred the fire, watching the embers breathe, then said, "Then we'll fix it again. Rust don't win unless you stop fighting." The next day, he built his first bell of ash. It wasn't large or perfect. It was forged from scrap beams and old mining steel. But when it rang, the sound cut clear through the valley, loud enough to stir the old machinery into motion for the first time in decades. The miners stopped their work, listening like they were hearing a long-lost song. That night, he told them of Driftmark, of the eternal flame, of Rowan, of Irene, of the keepers who never let the world warmth go cold. By dawn, they'd lit their own fires again. The Iron Barrens changed slow but sure. Within 10 years, the air no longer reeked of rust, and oil wildflowers grew along the ridges they slag heaps once piled. The bells multiplied first 2, then 10, then 100, each one stamped with Cole phrase, "Rust don't win, but peace never travels unchallenged." Far beyond the barrens, in the glass citadels of the southern coasts, a new order had begun to form. Bankers, technocrats, and thinkers who believed the keeping way was sentimental nonsense. They taught themselves the consolidators. To them, warmth was inefficient, compassion was chaos. Their creed was precision, their gospel control. They came first as traders, then as lenders, then as rulers. They bought the mines, the mills, even the bells, claiming they'd standardize the warmth and make it available for all coal. Gay Bearded by then knew that smell. It was greed again, wearing a cleaner coat. He tried to warn his people, telling them, "You can't mass-produce remembering. You can't sell what was meant to be shared." But by the time anyone listened, the consolidators had built the grid. It was a network, part machine, part mind, that pulled power from every flame, every forge, every bell resonance, claiming it would distribute warmth evenly to all corners of the world. For a while, it worked. Nights grew brighter, crops thrived, and work became easier. Folks started saying maybe the old ways were finally being improved upon. Then, one winter, the grid went silent. Not all at once. First the outer towns, then the Midlands, until even the citadels dimmed. It wasn't sabotage or collapse, it was emptiness. Cole stood before his forge that night, staring at his hands blackened with soot, and whispered, "They've drained it dry. When he struck the bell the next morning, no sound came out. The world had grown deaf to its own heart. He spent his final years walking from town to town, lighting small fires where he could, whispering the same lesson to any soul still listening. Warmth ain't a system, it a hand offered in the dark. When Cole passed, they found a notebook by his side. Scrawled in the back, half burned from ash, were the words, "If the warmth dies, start with one match. If that fails, breathe on the smoke. If that fails, wait. It'll remember you." No one knew if he meant it in prophecy or farewell. But years later, when a young girl from the Barrens uncovered one of his old forges and struck the bell again, it rang clear as sunrise. The sound traveled far, carried by the wind, crossing forests, rivers, and ruins until it reached the sea. And there, on drift-marked cliffs, the eternal flame flickered higher, as if answering back. The warmth had remembered, and that was enough to start the next beginning.